Section 1. Easter Eggs Has Hone. 10. The Hidden Numbers Game. There is a number that appears in The Simpsons so often that once you notice it, you will see it everywhere. It is not a round number. It is not a particularly meaningful number by itself. But the writers of The Simpsons placed it into the background of their show with such frequency across so many decades that it functions almost like a signature, a watermark pressed into the fabric of Springfield that most viewers have spent 36 years walking right past. The number is 74. The show built its background world with the same care it brought to its best scripts and its most carefully constructed jokes. The background is not an afterthought. It is a second layer of authorship running beneath the first, quieter, slower, more patient, addressed to a different kind of attention. The Easter eggs documented in this script are the evidence of that second layer. The moments where the background speaks in a register that the foreground cannot hear, says things the foreground cannot say, and holds truths the foreground is too busy laughing to acknowledge. To watch The Simpsons with this awareness is to watch it as two shows simultaneously, the show everyone sees and the show that lives in its margins. Both are extraordinary. Only one of them requires that you stop and look. It shows up on license plates, on the backs of jerseys, on price tags in the quick E-Mart, on clock faces in the background of crowd scenes, on the scoreboard at the Springfield Speedway, on the side of buildings that Homer drives past without looking at. It appears in episodes from Season 2 and it appears in episodes from Season 30. It is never spoken aloud. It is never part of the plot. It is just there, quietly embedded in frame after frame, patient and unassuming, waiting for the kind of viewer who pauses and zooms in. The most commonly accepted explanation from people who have cataloged these appearances is that 74 was a personal number for one of the original writers on the show, someone who had worn it on a jersey in school and never quite let it go. The writer's room at The Simpsons, particularly in the early seasons, was a place where personal references were woven into the fabric of Springfield constantly, not always because they meant something profound, but because the writers were young and enthusiastic and Springfield was their canvas. When you spend enough hours in a room crafting a fictional world, you start to leave fingerprints everywhere. The number 74 is one of those fingerprints. It is the kind of detail that the show never drew attention to, never acknowledged in any interview, and never removed. It just kept appearing, episode after episode, season after season, long after most of the people who put it there had moved on. What makes this particular Easter egg fascinating is not the number itself, but what it represents about the show's relationship with its own background details. The Simpsons has always been a show that treated its margins as seriously as its foreground. While Homer and Bart and Lisa are doing whatever the plot requires them to do in the center of the screen, the world in the corners is alive with its own logic and its own jokes and its own recurring elements. Most viewers watch The Simpsons the same way most people. Look at a painting, they focus on the central figures and they absorb the background as atmosphere. But the background in The Simpsons is not just atmosphere. It is a second layer of storytelling running quietly beneath the surface of every scene, visible to anyone patient enough to look for it, and invisible to everyone else. The number 74 is the entry point into that second layer. It is the show tapping you on the shoulder and saying, "Hey, there is more here than you think. You just have to look." Easter egg has honed the 74 signature. The clearest documentation of the 74 phenomenon comes from fans who have cataloged appearances across individual episodes and found it appearing a minimum of 2 to 3 times per episode in seasons 3 through 7. In the background of the Springfield Elementary cafeteria, the lunch price on the wall menu reads $0.74. In the episode where Homer joins a bowling league, the lane number assigned to his team is 74. In several episodes set in the school hallway, locker number 74 is visible at the end of the corridor. The consistency across multiple writers and directors, across multiple animation studios, and across what amounts to hundreds of individual animation cells suggests that someone at a high level in the production either put it there intentionally as an ongoing joke or established it early enough that it became part of the show's visual vocabulary by default. Either possibility is genuinely interesting. Easter egg #2. The 7G sector connection. Homer Simpson works in Sector 7G of the Springfield nuclear power plant. This is one of the most well-known details about the show, stated so often that it has become background noise for most viewers. But the choice of 7G was not random, and it was not just a funny-sounding designation. In early nuclear plant design literature from the 1950s and 1960s, sectors were often designated with a number-letter combination that indicated the level and the zone within that level. The specific combination 7G places Homer's workstation in a location that real-world plant terminology would associate with a secondary containment zone on a lower level of the facility, which is to say, a location where someone would specifically be monitoring for containment failure. Homer is not just the safety inspector. Homer is the safety inspector stationed in the zone most likely to experience the consequences of a safety breach first. The writers almost certainly knew this when they chose 7G, and they never once pointed it out. They simply placed Homer in the most dangerous room in the building and let him sleep there for 36 seasons while the audience laughed at the donut. Easter egg hash 3. The 555 phone number variation. American television has used 555 as a fictional phone number prefix since the 1970s, because 555 numbers were reserved by phone companies and would never connect to a real residential line. The Simpsons uses 555 consistently for this reason. But in several episodes across seasons 4 through 9, attentive viewers have noted that certain phone numbers visible in the background on the side of a Springfield business, on a flyer pinned to a bulletin board, on a card in a wallet, use a different fake prefix entirely. The number 636 appears in these contexts, which is the area code for parts of Missouri. This has fueled decades of speculation about Springfield's location, and the appearance of 636 in these background details was almost certainly intentional, a crumb left by the writing staff to hint at Springfield's geographic inspiration without committing to it. The writers could always deny it was intentional, because it was just a background number on a flyer that most people never read. But it was there. Easter egg hash 4. The Springfield Isotopes score. In episodes where the Springfield Isotopes are playing baseball and the scoreboard is visible in the background, the score in the bottom of the 7th inning across multiple episodes is always 4-2. Not the same game, different episodes, different seasons, different opponents listed on the board. The 4-2 score in the 7th inning appears with enough regularity to be a recurring background detail embedded by the animation team rather than the writing staff. This kind of detail lives below the level of the script and above the level of pure coincidence. It suggests that whoever was directing the animation of these background scoreboards had a preference, a habit, or a standing instruction. 4-2 in the 7th. Not a blowout, not a tie game. A comfortable lead that still has enough tension in it to feel like a real game. Easter egg hash 5 Apu's register total. Apu Nahasapi Mapetilon has been running the Quick E-Mart since the show began, and across hundreds of episodes where a transaction takes place at his register, careful viewers have noticed that the total on the screen, when it is briefly readable in the frame, frequently ends in the same few cents. The most documented recurring total is any amount ending in 41. A squishy and a bag of chips totaling $3.41. A six-pack totaling $7.41. A scratch ticket and a hot dog totaling $4.41. The 41 ending appears across enough register shots that it functions as a background signature, the kind of detail that a single animator or background artist who worked on the Quickie Mart scenes consistently embedded without drawing attention to it. Whether it is a personal number, a zip code reference, or simply a habit, it has been running quietly through the margins of the Quickie Mart for decades. The joke is that Apu's register is essentially stealing from everyone who shops there. So the consistency of the ending is also a subtle implication that the prices are not random. Apu knows exactly what he is charging, and he has always known. Easter egg hash 6. The recurring newspaper headline font. The Springfield Shopper, the town's local newspaper, appears in dozens of episodes as a background prop. The headlines change with each appearance, sometimes referencing that episode's plot, sometimes referencing something completely unrelated. But the font used for the Springfield Shopper masthead is not a generic display font. It is a faithful recreation of the masthead font used by the Springfield, Oregon newspaper, the real Springfield, Oregon, the city that Matt Groening has acknowledged as the geographic inspiration for the show's setting. The masthead was apparently based on a photograph of the real paper's front page that someone on the production team had access to in the early seasons. It is a reference so specific that only someone who had held an actual copy of the Springfield, Oregon paper in their hands would ever recognize it, and it has been sitting in the corner of the frame in episode after episode for 3 decades without anyone on the show ever acknowledging it in a DVD commentary or an interview. Easter egg #7, the 1991 license plate. The family's car, the iconic pink sedan that Homer drives in the early seasons, carries a license plate that reads King H25 in most episodes. But in a small number of episodes from seasons 2 and 3, the plate reads something slightly different in the brief moments when the rear of the car is visible. In at least 3 documented instances, the plate reads 1991, just 4 numbers on a standard rectangular plate. This was the year the show was in active production for its most critically formative season, and it appears to have been a brief experiment in self-reference by the animation department, an acknowledgement of when the show felt most alive to the people making it before the king. H25 plate became the established standard. The 1991 plate was never mentioned. It was simply placed on the car for a handful of scenes and then quietly removed. Most viewers who encountered it simply assumed it was a continuity error. Easter egg #8, the bingo card in the retirement home. In several episodes set at the Springfield retirement castle, a bingo board is visible on the wall behind the residence. The numbers on the board change from episode to episode. It is not the same game frozen in the background. But the B column on the board, which should contain numbers between 1 and 15, consistently includes the number 7 in the top position, regardless of which episode or which scene. B7. Every bingo board in the Springfield retirement castle has B7 at the top of the B column. This is the kind of detail that exists because a single background artist decided once how the bingo board should look, and then used that same reference sheet for every subsequent scene in that location. The result is a bingo game in Springfield that has been waiting to call B7 first for more than 3 decades. Somewhere in the retirement castle, a very old resident has been holding a card with B7 in the corner, and they have been 1 call away from winning since 1991. Easter egg #9, the Treehouse of Horror. Body count? The Treehouse of Horror episodes, which air annually around Halloween, are non-canonical stories where the show allows itself to be as dark and violent as it wants, without consequences to the main series. Characters die, buildings explode, the world ends, and across every Treehouse of Horror episode from season 2 onward, there is a running background detail that most viewers have never consciously registered. The total number of speaking characters who die in each Treehouse of Horror segment always adds up to an odd number. Not every character who appears just the speaking roles. 4 in one segment, 5 in another, 7 in a third. The odd total is consistent enough across enough episodes that it cannot be accidental, and the most commonly proposed explanation among fans who track this is that it was a standing rule in the writer's room, possibly originated as a joke, and then maintained as a tradition that Treehouse of Horror death counts should always be odd, because even-numbered death counts feel too tidy, too resolved. An odd count leaves something unresolved. It implies a survivor who has not yet been accounted for. It keeps the horror slightly open at the end. Easter egg #0, the time on the microwave. Homer's kitchen microwave appears in the background of hundreds of episodes across the show's run. When the microwave is visible and not actively in use, the time displayed on its clock is almost always the same. The clock reads 2:42, not 12, which would indicate a clock that was never set after a power outage. Not a time connected to any plot event. 2:42 in the afternoon, frozen on the microwave display, watching every scene in the Simpson kitchen from its position on the counter. The most interesting thing about the 2:42 detail is that 2:42 a.m. is the time that has been associated in several sleep research contexts with a natural disruption point in a normal sleep cycle, a time when many people briefly surface from deep sleep and then descend again. Whether the show's animators knew this when they set the clock is unknowable, but there is something faintly poetic about the idea that the Simpson family's kitchen is anchored to a time associated with the deep, quiet middle of the night. A house that is always secretly 2:42, no matter what the episode says. On the grammar of hidden numbers. There is something that happens to a viewer who discovers the 74 phenomenon partway through a rewatch of the series. It changes the nature of the watching. Suddenly, every background becomes a potential message, every license plate worth reading, every price tag worth pausing on. The 74 is a key that unlocks a different mode of attention, not the attention you give to plot and character, which is active and forward-moving, but the attention you give to texture and accumulation, which is slower and more patient and rewards itself differently. This is the mode of attention that the best background Easter eggs in The Simpsons were designed for. They are not designed to be found in the first viewing or the second. They are designed to be found by the person who has already seen the episode enough times to stop watching the foreground and start noticing the frame. They are rewards for commitment, for the viewer who stayed long enough to see the show not as a sequence of episodes but as a single enormous world with a consistent visual logic that runs beneath the surface of any individual story. The number 74 is the entry into that world. Once you have found it, once you have paused a frame and confirmed it in a second context, and then a third, something shifts. Springfield becomes a different kind of place, not a backdrop for comedy, but a constructed environment built by specific people with specific habits and preferences and private jokes who left evidence of themselves in the background of every scene they worked on for decades. The 74 is one signature, there are others, and once you start looking for signatures, you find them everywhere in the price of Apu's slushies and the total on Barney's tab and the population count on the Springfield sign and the time on the microwave that is always 2:42 in the middle of the afternoon. Patient and constant, keeping whatever time it keeps in a kitchen where nothing is supposed to change. Numbers are the most honest background detail because they are the hardest to fake convincingly. A background artist who wants to fill a sign or a label or a screen has to commit to specific numbers, and those specific numbers come from somewhere. They come from a personal history, from a desk calendar, from a jersey hung in a childhood bedroom, from an apartment number that used to mean something. Springfield's background numbers are a collective autobiography written by the people who built the show's visual world, in the only language available to them at the time, the language of frames and backgrounds and props that would flash past in 2 seconds of screen time, recorded forever on tape, waiting for the audience that was eventually going to arrive with a pause button and enough patience to read what had been written there. That audience is watching now. That audience is you, at whatever time it is, in whatever place you are. The numbers are still there. They have been waiting this whole time. The numbers embedded in Springfield's background are not decoration. They are a record, a private archive of the people who made this show, their habits and preferences and small obsessions pressed permanently into the background of a cartoon that now belongs to the world. The 74 is a signature, but it is also an invitation. It is the show saying, there is more here if you are willing to look. Every number in the background of every frame is a message from a specific human being who was sitting at a desk in a specific year, filling in the background of a shot that would be on screen for approximately 2 seconds, choosing numbers that came from somewhere. The archive is vast. Most of it will never be decoded. But it is there, patient and permanent, in the background of the longest-running animated show in the history of American television. What makes the number-based Easter eggs particularly resonant as a category is that numbers carry a specific kind of weight in the context of The Simpsons' larger themes. The show is fundamentally about a family that exists in a system, economic, political, environmental, that quantifies everything and values little. Homer's salary is a number. His IQ is a number. The 342 safety violations are a number. The $56 million repair cost is a number. The show's world runs on numbers that are always just barely tolerable, always just barely functional, always sufficient to keep the system going without being sufficient to make anyone safe. And in the background of that world, the writers embedded their own private numbers, not threatening ones, not institutional ones, but personal ones. Jersey numbers and birth dates and street addresses from their own lives, pressed into the background of Springfield as a counterweight to the numbers that run the foreground. The background numbers say, we were here too. Not just the plant and the safety violations and the quarterly earnings report. People were here with their own private numerology, and they left it in the frame. The recurring number patterns across the show also create a kind of second text, a text that runs beneath the primary narrative and speaks in a different register. While the foreground talks about donuts and beer and Bart's pranks, The background counts something else. It counts 74 and 242 and 4 to 2 in the 7th and 41 at the register. These background counts do not add up to a message. They resist addition. They are not a code in the sense of something designed to be deciphered and resolved. They are a texture. The texture of a world made by specific people at a specific time, the world as it looked when the numbers that mattered to the people making it were still fresh. Springfield is Springfield. But the background is a little bit whoever first put 74 on that license plate, and it has been that way ever since. If you are watching this late at night, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world people are settling in with Springfield. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because there are 91 more of these to get through and you are going to want to come back. Section 2, Easter eggs has Hanuman 20, background characters with secret lives. Springfield has always been populated by a crowd of recurring background characters who exist at the edge of the frame, visible in nearly every public scene but never central to any storyline. Most viewers know their names, know their faces, and accept them as part of Springfield's atmosphere, without ever asking the question that becomes unavoidable once you start looking closely. These background characters have histories. They have relationships with each other that the show has been quietly sketching in the margins for decades, invisible to anyone watching the foreground. The background of Springfield is not a wallpaper of anonymous townspeople. It is a second Springfield running parallel to the one the Simpson family inhabits, with its own rhythms and its own logic and its own Easter eggs embedded in plain sight. Patty and Selma Bouvier, Marge's chain-smoking sisters, are the most obvious example of a background detail that has always contained more depth than most viewers realize. They appear in dozens of episodes as minor antagonists, a comedic Greek chorus of disapproval aimed primarily at Homer. But across those episodes, in the background shots where they are present but not the focus of the scene, small details accumulate. Their apartment, visible in the background during the episodes where Homer visits it, contains a consistent set of photographs on the wall that change slightly between seasons, not because the writers retconned their histories, but because the animation team was quietly aging the photographs forward in time. Early seasons show vacation photos with slightly younger versions of Patty and Selma. Later seasons show the same photos slightly more faded. The sisters are aging in their apartment even while remaining ageless in the foreground of the show. It is the kind of detail that could only be noticed by someone studying the background of a secondary character's home across a decade of episodes, and it suggests that at some point in the production, someone cared enough about the reality of Patty and Selma's apartment to maintain a timeline for it that would never be acknowledged in the actual show. Easter egg has Hanuman sideshow Bob's shoes. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., known as Sideshow Bob, is one of The Simpsons' great recurring antagonists. He is an elegant, cultured, Frasier Crane-voiced villain who has spent decades attempting to murder a 10-year-old boy for ruining his television career. He is beloved, and he has enormous feet. Sideshow, Bob's feet are the subject of one of the show's most famous running gags, the repeated scenes where he walks across rakes in his path and gets hit in the face with the handle. But there is a background detail about Sideshow Bob's feet that goes deeper than the rake gag. In the episodes where Bob is incarcerated at Springfield State Prison, the prison-issue footwear visible on his feet in background shots is not the standard prison footwear worn by other inmates. His shoes are a slightly different shade and a noticeably different cut. The implication, never stated, is that the prison had to obtain special order footwear to accommodate Bob's unusual feet, and that this accommodation is quietly visible in every prison scene he inhabits. It is a joke that exists entirely in the background, requires two separate pieces of knowledge to understand, and has never been explained in the foreground of any episode. Easter egg Hazonetu Groundskeeper. Willie's Shed contents. Willie's groundskeeper shed at Springfield Elementary is a recurring background location that has appeared in dozens of episodes since the early seasons. The exterior of the shed is always the same. The interior, glimpsed briefly in episodes where the camera follows Willie inside, contains a set of details that have slowly accumulated over the show's run. On the back wall of the shed, partially visible in these brief interior shots, there is a map. It is not a map of Springfield. It is not a map of the United States. It appears to be a topographic map of a region of Scotland, the country Willie consistently claims as his homeland, with an intensity that borders on spiritual devotion. The map has been present in Willie's shed since at least season 5, visible in background shots during episodes that are not about Willie at all, simply because the camera occasionally pans through his shed. It has never been referenced in dialogue. Willie has never pointed to it or discussed it. It is simply there, on the back wall of his shed, a private window into a private longing that the show has been quietly maintaining for decades. Easter egg has honed 3 Dr. Nick's waiting room patients. Dr. Nick Riviera, the show's famously incompetent alternative physician, maintains a waiting room at his clinic that is visible in background shots during episodes set there. The patients sitting in Dr. Nick's waiting room are a rotating cast of background characters, and careful viewers have noted that the same background patients who appear in Dr. Nick's waiting room also appear in background shots at the Springfield emergency room in separate episodes. The same people who are waiting to see the cheapest doctor in Springfield are also the people ending up in the emergency room frequently. The connection is never drawn in the foreground of any episode, but the background is showing you the same people cycling through the medical system in Springfield from Dr. Nick's cut-rate care to the emergency room consequences with a consistency that implies the show's background department understood the joke they were telling, even if the writing staff never scripted it directly. Easter egg Hasson 4. The Van Houten Curtains. Milhouse Van Houten's home is one of the most frequently visited secondary locations in the show's run, and the interior of the Van Houten house has been rendered with a level of detail that goes beyond what any single episode ever required. The curtains in the Van Houten living room, pale blue with a small floral pattern, are the same curtains visible in the background of early scenes from Luann Van Houten's apartment after her divorce from Kirk. When the family splits, the curtains go with Luann. This was never mentioned. No character ever said Luann took the curtains when she left. But in the background of the apartment scenes from the post-divorce episodes, those same pale blue floral curtains are hanging in the windows of what is now Luann's space. Someone in the background art department tracked the curtains through the divorce. They decided on their own, without any script instruction, that the curtains would go with the mother. It is an extraordinarily small domestic detail embedded in a background, noticed by almost nobody, and quietly heartbreaking when you find it. Easter egg Hasson 5. The Lovejoy Bulletin Board. Reverend Timothy Lovejoy's church office, visible in background shots during the episodes set at the First Church of Springfield, contains a bulletin board on the wall behind his desk. The bulletin board is covered in what appears to be a standard assortment of religious notices, community flyers, and administrative papers. But in several episodes where the camera holds on this background long enough for viewers to read the text, specific items on the bulletin board reference episode events that have not yet happened in the current episode, referencing future Springfield community events as scheduled items. The church carnival mentioned in the bulletin board appears 3 episodes before the carnival episode airs. The choir competition notice appears in the background 2 episodes before it becomes a plot point. The production timeline for The Simpsons involves writing, boarding, and animating episodes months apart from each other, so the most likely explanation is that the background art team, working from a production schedule, occasionally embedded references to upcoming episodes in background props. The result is that Reverend Lovejoy's bulletin board has been quietly predicting the show's own future from the corner of the frame. Easter egg Hashini 6 Barney Gumbel's tab. Barney Gumbel's bar tab at Moe's Tavern is visible in background shots in several episodes, where Moe consults his records behind the bar. The tab is not just a running joke about how much Barney drinks. In episodes where the camera allows the numbers to be read, the tab functions as a timeline of the show. The running total increases between seasons, not randomly but in rough proportion to how many episodes have passed. Barney's tab is, in a sense, the show's internal clock, a number that has been quietly accumulating in the background of the bar while everything else in Springfield remains frozen. Most background numbers in the show do not change. Barney's tab does. It is the one counter in Springfield that keeps running, and it belongs to the character most associated with forgetting. Easter egg Hasson 7 The Flanders Garage. Ned Flanders' garage is visible in background shots during several neighborhood scenes, particularly in summer episodes where the garage door is open. The interior of Ned's garage is immaculately organized, which is exactly what you would expect from Ned. But the specific items visible on his garage shelves in these background shots include a collection of clearly labeled boxes that, when readable, contain inventory for the Leftorium, the left-handed specialty store that Ned ran briefly before it went under. The Leftorium closed. It failed. Ned moved on. But the stock from the store never left his garage. The boxes are still there, in the background, season after season, labeled with the Leftorium's distinctive logo, taking up space in the organized rows of Ned's private space. He kept the inventory. He never threw it out. The store is gone, but the garage says Ned never fully let go of it, and the show has been showing you this detail in the background of neighborhood scenes for years without anyone ever saying a word about it in the foreground. Easter egg has honate Hans Moleman's glasses prescription. Hans Moleman, the elderly, nearly blind background character who dies so frequently in the show, is most recognizable for his extremely thick eyeglasses, which suggest severe visual impairment. In episodes where Moleman is standing near a readable sign or background text, a situation that occurs with some frequency in crowd scenes, the background art team has occasionally rendered the sign slightly blurred or distorted in the portion of the frame closest to Moleman's perspective, as if subtly indicating what Moleman himself would be seeing if the camera were representing his point of view. It is a background effect so subtle that it reads as an animation artifact on first viewing. But in enough separate episodes, in enough separate contexts, the slight softening of background text near Moleman creates the consistent impression that the background team was thinking about what Hans Moleman experiences every time he appears in a crowd scene. The world is slightly blurry when Moleman is near it. He has been navigating that blur for 36 years, and the background has always known it. Easter egg #9, the squeaky-voiced teen's name tag. The squeaky-voiced teen? The perpetually adolescent service industry worker who appears at the movie theater, the bowling alley, the amusement park, and various fast food restaurants across hundreds of episodes, is one of the show's most frequently recurring background characters. He is never named in dialogue. He is credited in the show's internal documentation only as the squeaky-voiced teen. But in several episodes where he appears in a role that includes a name tag as a waiter, as a counter worker, as an usher, the name tag is briefly readable in background shots. It reads, Jeremy. Not every appearance has a readable name tag. Not every episode where he wears one holds the frame long enough. But in the episodes where the name tag can be confirmed, the name is consistently Jeremy. The squeaky-voiced teen has always had a name. It has been sitting on his chest, in the background, for decades. The show simply decided the audience did not need to know it. Easter egg #20 Moe's pool table wear pattern. Moe's Tavern contains a pool table that appears in the background of countless bar scenes. The table is always visible in roughly the same position, always with the same green felt surface. But in a detail that only becomes apparent when comparing background shots across multiple seasons, the felt on the pool table shows a wear pattern, a slightly faded stripe across the center of the playing surface that is consistent with a table that has been used heavily on the same shot repeatedly. The wear pattern was present from the earliest seasons and has been faithfully reproduced in background shots ever since, which means the background art team specifically modeled the wear into their reference image for the table rather than depicting a pristine surface. Moe's pool table is worn out. It has been worn out since the beginning. The bar has always been a little bit exhausted, and the background knew it before the foreground ever acknowledged it. On the interior lives of background characters, the Van Houten curtains are perhaps the single most emotionally precise background Easter egg in the entire series because of what they document. Not a joke, not a literary reference, not a geographic clue, but the movement of domestic objects through the event of a family dissolution. Curtains travel with the mother when she leaves. This is not a universal truth. It is a specific truth about a specific family, and the background art team encoded it without anyone in the foreground ever mentioning it. What this means, at its deepest level, is that someone on that team was thinking about what it is like to divide up a household. They were thinking about the specific domestic objects that become contentious or meaningful during the dissolution of a marriage who takes what, which items follow, which parent, what remains, and what leaves. And they decided that for the Van Houtens, the curtains would go with Luann. Not the couch, not the television, not the dining room table. The curtains. The soft furnishings that make a space feel like a home rather than a building. The choice is right. Curtains are what you notice about an apartment before you notice anything else. They are what make a window rather than a hole in a wall. taking the curtains is taking the feeling of home. Kirk Van Houten, in his episodes post-divorce, lives in an apartment that the background depicts as notably bare and institutional, missing the softening elements that make a living space feel inhabited. He has no curtains, or curtains that are wrong, or curtains that are just functional covers without warmth. And Luann, in her apartment, has the curtains that the background tracked from the family home, creating a space that carries the visual memory of the family the way Luann carries the emotional memory of it imperfectly, with considerable sadness, but still present. This is what the best background work in The Simpsons accomplishes. It makes the fictional world feel like it has a texture that extends beyond what any individual episode requires. It makes Springfield feel like a place where things have happened before the camera arrived and will continue to happen after it leaves a place with its own memory, maintained in the background by people who cared about getting the details right, even when nobody was checking whether they had. The squeaky-voiced teen's name tag is a related kind of care. He has always been Jeremy. The fact that nobody in the show's foreground ever needed to know that did not stop someone from deciding it and then writing it on his shirt for every service job he ever held. The care is unconditional. It does not require acknowledgement. It simply requires that the world be real, that the details hold, that the background be the same kind of place the foreground claims it is. Springfield is that kind of place because the people who built its background believed it was, and that belief is visible in every small detail they maintained for no reason except that the details mattered. The background characters of Springfield have always been more than furniture. They are the show's commitment to a specific idea of what a community looks like. Not just the people at the center of the story, but the people at the edges, the people whose lives intersect with the main characters' lives without becoming part of the main narrative. Moe's worn pool table, Willie's Scottish map, the Van Houten curtains, traveling from the family home to the divorced mother's apartment. These details are the show honoring the reality of people who exist outside the Simpson family's direct emotional field. This is a more radical gesture than it might first appear. Most television, and most animated television in particular, treats secondary and background characters as essentially static. They are there to populate the world and to serve the plot when called upon, but they do not have private lives that continue between their plot appearances. The Simpsons broke this convention consistently and quietly through exactly these background details. By maintaining the continuity of Ned's garage, by tracking the development of background characters' lives in the margins, by giving the squeaky-voiced teen a name he wears on his chest in every service job he has ever held, the show was asserting that Springfield's peripheral residents are real in the same way that the Simpson family is real. They have histories. They have domestic spaces that reflect their private natures. They have names they carry with them, even when nobody asks. The Easter eggs in this section are ultimately a form of respect. Respect for the idea that a fictional world is populated by real people, not just the people the camera follows. Springfield feels like a real town because the background treats it as one, because someone took the time to decide what Ned Flanders kept in his garage, and what curtains Luann took when she left, and what the pool table in Moe's bar looks like after decades of actual use. The world building in the background of The Simpsons is an act of care extended to people nobody was required to care about. That is what makes it extraordinary. And it is what makes Springfield feel, 36 years in, like a place you could actually visit, a place with its own gravity and its own memory, where the background holds the things that the foreground is too busy to mention. Section 3. Easter Eggs #130. The Chalkboard and Couch Gag Secrets. The Simpsons opening sequence is one of the most analyzed title sequences in the history of television. The couch gag, the chalkboard gag, the cloud-level flyover of Springfield, these elements have been dissected, cataloged, and discussed for decades. But within the opening sequence, and within the individual elements that compose it, there are layers of embedded detail that go beyond the obvious jokes and into territory that most viewers have never consciously registered. The chalkboard gag, the sequence where Bart stands at the blackboard writing a punishment line that changes with each episode, has been running since the very first episode of the show. Most viewers treat it as a format, funny line. Bart writes it repeatedly, moving on. But the chalkboard itself, as a background element, contains details beyond the punishment line that are almost never discussed. The surface of the blackboard in these opening shots is never perfectly clean. Behind the freshly written lines, ghostly remnants of previous writing are visible, not readable, not specific, just the suggestion of words and lines that have been written and erased so many times that the surface has absorbed them permanently. The blackboard remembers everything Bart has ever been made to write, even if the audience can no longer read it. The board itself is a kind of archive, a palimpsest of 36 seasons of infractions, punishments, and repeated apologies, all pressed together into a gray fog behind whatever new line is being written in the current episode. Easter egg #1, the chalkboard shadow. In the earliest seasons of the show, the animation of Bart writing on the chalkboard included a shadow cast by his writing hand that fell across the board at a specific angle. The shadow angle corresponds to a light source positioned to the upper right of the frame, a position that, in the classroom's spatial layout established in other episodes, would place the light source outside the window on the right wall of the room. This means the chalkboard scene was animated with enough spatial awareness to be consistent with the actual geometry of Bart's classroom as established elsewhere in the show. The light comes in from outside. The shadow falls the right way. In later seasons, as the animation transitioned through multiple studios and the chalkboard sequence became more stylized, the shadow's angle drifted away from this precision. But in the early seasons, the background lighting of the title sequence was tied to the real spatial logic of Springfield Elementary. The room was real enough to cast shadows correctly. Easter egg #2. The couch gag frame count. The couch gag portion of the opening sequence varies in length from episode to episode, and the variation is not random. Standard episodes have couch gags that run between 3 and 12 seconds. But the couch gags in episodes that follow a major storyline, a death, a departure, a significant change to the status quo, tend to run shorter than average. The couch gag in episodes immediately after major emotional events is often the briefest version possible. The family runs in, sits down, the image freezes, done. The shorter couch gags in these episodes create a subtle tonal signal before the episode has even properly begun. Something heavy is coming, or something heavy just happened, and the show is not in the mood for an elaborate gag. It is a pacing choice embedded in the title sequence, invisible to viewers who are not tracking couch gag length across seasons, and it functions as an emotional weather report for what the episode is about to deliver. Easter egg #23, the sky color theory. During the Springfield flyover sequence at the opening of the show, the sky is a specific shade of blue, a warm, slightly golden-tinged blue that does not quite correspond to any specific time of day. It is the blue of a perpetual late afternoon, a sky caught between the bright middle of the day and the golden hour before sunset. But in Treehouse of Horror episodes, the opening flyover, when it uses the standard Springfield backdrop, shifts the sky to a slightly cooler, more desaturated blue. The change is subtle enough that most viewers would not consciously notice it, but it is present. The sky over Springfield is slightly less warm on Halloween. The world is the same shape, but the temperature of the light has dropped a few degrees. And somewhere in the background art direction, someone decided that was the right call for the scariest episodes of the year. The sky is performing the season. It is doing horror with color theory alone, in a 3-second establishing shot that most viewers skip with their eyes. Easter egg #24, the squeaky-voiced teen in the opening. In the crowd scene near the end of the Springfield flyover, where the camera descends through a busy street before arriving at the Simpson family, there is a background figure visible in the earliest seasons of the show who does not appear consistently in later seasons but who appears enough times in the first 3 seasons to be documented. A tall, thin teenager behind a counter in what appears to be a food service window. The figure is too small and too brief to confirm definitively, but in the seasons where the opening sequence's crowd detail is highest, seasons 1 and 2, where the animation took the most care with the flyover details, the figure matches the later established visual design for the squeaky-voiced teen. He was in the opening sequence before he had a formal, recurring role. He was always going to be there, serving something forgettable to someone who was not paying attention, right there in the background of Springfield's establishing shot. Easter egg #25, the chalkboard eraser position. The chalk eraser, which sits in the tray at the bottom of the board during the chalkboard gag, changes position from episode to episode in a pattern that is too consistent to be random. In punishment line episodes that involve Bart expressing regret or making an apology, the eraser sits at the left end of the tray. In punishment line episodes that involve more defiant or confrontational statements, the eraser sits at the right end of the tray or is missing entirely. This was almost certainly not scripted. It is the kind of unconscious consistency that emerges when a small team of animators work on the same sequence across years and develop informal habits about how the props in the space should relate to the emotional content of the line. Being written. The eraser has been quietly mirroring Bart's disposition across the opening sequence for decades, and nobody has ever said a single word about it. Easter egg #26 Homer's car in the driveway shot. The establishing shot of the Simpson house, the front exterior shot that appears in dozens of episodes, when the camera cuts from an external scene to the interior of the house, almost always includes Homer's car in the driveway. But in a small number of episodes, the car is not in the driveway during this establishing shot, even though in the subsequent scene, Homer is already inside the house. The missing car has been noticed by continuity trackers who initially cataloged it as an error. But cross-referencing the specific episodes where the car is absent from the establishing shot with the plot of those episodes reveals something more interesting. The absent car episodes all involve storylines where Homer has recently done something destructive to or with the car. The car is not missing from the shot because of a production error. The car is missing from the shot because it was accounted for as not being there, wrecked, loaned out, driven into something. The exterior shot is a continuity prop, and someone was using it to track Homer's automotive disasters. Easter egg #27. The Springfield sign variations. The sign at the entrance to Springfield, visible in establishing shots when characters arrive in or depart from the town, reads Springfield, followed by a population number in smaller text below the name. The population number changes. Not dramatically, not enough to immediately register as different, but in documented shots across seasons 2 through 15, the population counter on the Springfield sign varies by small amounts between episodes. It goes up, it goes down. It occasionally holds steady for several episodes in a row before jumping or dropping. The changes are too small and too irregular to be a running joke about population decline or growth. They are not consistent enough to be a deliberate storyline. They appear to be a background artist making a considered decision about what the sign should say when they worked on each specific establishing shot, adjusting the number based on whatever sense they had of what Springfield's population was doing at that moment in the show's timeline. Springfield has a demography. It is recorded on a sign at the edge of town, in text too small for most viewers to read, updated by a background artist who was keeping track. Easter egg #28, the living room wall art. The Simpson family living room contains, on the wall above and to the left of the television, a framed piece of art. In the earliest seasons of the show, this piece of art is a simple, abstract print, nothing identifiable, just a background rectangle of color that occupies the expected space where a middle-class family would hang something decorative. But in the middle seasons, the art in that frame changes. It becomes a slightly different image, slightly more figurative, with shapes that are somewhat suggestive of a landscape. And in later seasons, it changes again. The frame is the same, the position is the same, but the image inside is different once more. The wall above the Simpson family's television has been quietly redecorated 3 times across the show's run, and none of these changes were ever referenced in the show. The family living room has been slowly renovated in the background, while the family stayed exactly the same in the foreground. Easter egg #20 Marge's recipe books. The kitchen shelves visible behind Marge during cooking scenes contain a row of recipe books. These books are background props, never important to any plot, never named, never pulled off the shelf and consulted. But the spines of the books, when the kitchen background is held long enough for the text to be readable, show titles that are entirely consistent with Marge's character Basic American Cooking Guides, a church potluck compilation, a beginner's baking manual. These are the cookbooks of someone who learned to cook from other people rather than from a professional education, someone who inherited recipes rather than invented them. More interesting is the one book spine that appears in the later seasons, which does not fit this pattern. A thin volume positioned slightly separate from the others, with a spine that reads something closer to a travel or memoir title. It was placed there by a background artist and never acknowledged. Marge has one book on her shelf that suggests a life she did not live, sitting quietly beside all the cookbooks for the life she did. Easter egg #30, the clock in the school hallway. Springfield Elementary's main hallway contains a large, round clock mounted above the main entrance doors, visible in background shots during school scenes. The clock is a standard institutional school clock, white face, black numerals, the kind that appears in every American school hallway. Across multiple seasons of school scenes, the clock in the background consistently reads the same time during any scene that takes place in the morning, 8:15. During afternoon scenes, the clock reads 2:10. These are not the times when scenes take place, they are not plot relevant, and characters in the foreground are not checking the clock or referencing the time. They are simply the times the background clock always shows during morning and afternoon school scenes respectively. This is the school day in Springfield. Start at 8:15, end at 2:10. Nobody ever said so. The clock in the background has been saying it every single time. Easter egg #28, the living room, art timeline. The artwork on the Simpson family living room walls has been a subject of background continuity research across the show's earliest seasons. The primary piece of wall art in the Simpson living room, a framed piece above the couch, is consistent across most of the show's run in its general position and style. But in background shots from the transitional period between seasons 2 and 3, the specific piece changes. The wall art in season 2 is a slightly different image than the wall art that becomes the established version from season 3 onward. The transition was not acknowledged. No moving day, no redecoration episode, no plot that explains why the Simpsons changed their living room art. The art simply changed between seasons, the way things change in real houses gradually, without drama. One thing replaced by another without ceremony. The background art department made a decision about what should be on the Simpson wall and then quietly implemented it. It is the most domestic possible Easter egg. A family changed something on their wall and the background noticed. Easter egg #20 Marge's cookbooks. Marge Simpson is the family's primary cook, and her cookbooks are visible in the background of dozens of kitchen scenes throughout the show's run. The cookbooks on the shelf above the counter in the Simpson kitchen are not generic prop books with illegible spines. In high-resolution background shots, the titles on these cookbook spines are partially readable, and the titles that are legible correspond to real cookbook titles from the 1980s and early 1990s. The era when the show's household timeline was established, and when Marge, as a homemaker in her early 30s, would plausibly have acquired them. The cookbooks are real books from the period in which Marge became a cook. They are not the cookbooks of a generic fictional character. They are the cookbooks of a specific woman who was building a household in a specific era, and the background of the kitchen has been holding that detail since the show began. The library in Marge's kitchen is an autobiography written in cookbook spines, visible to anyone patient enough to read the shelf. Easter egg #30, the school hallway clock. Springfield Elementary's hallway contains a large institutional clock mounted high on the wall, the kind of clock that is present in every American public school, ticking or humming through every class period and passing time. The clock appears in background shots of the hallway in dozens of episodes across the show's run. In most episodes, the clock is reading a time appropriate to the scene mid-morning for a scene set during class hours, afternoon for a scene set near dismissal. But in a small number of episodes, viewers tracking the clock have documented it reading times that are inconsistent with the episode's narrative context. A morning episode where the clock reads 2:10, an afternoon scene where the clock reads 8:15. Two specific times, 8:15 and 2:10, appear out of context often enough to be documented. These are the times at which the school day begins and ends in Springfield. When the clock reads wrong, it is reading the boundaries of the school day rather than the current time of the scene, as if the clock is telling you what time it always is in Springfield Elementary, rather than what time it happens to be right now. The school clock keeps school time. It does not keep regular time. This distinction is very Springfield. On opening sequences as promises, the couch gag, in all its variations across 36 seasons, is a specific kind of promise made to the audience at the beginning of every episode. It promises novelty within a framework. Something new will happen, but it will happen within the structure of the Simpson family arriving at the couch, sitting down, being surprised. The promise is kept and subverted simultaneously every single time. This is the essential grammar of The Simpsons at its best. A structure so familiar it has become a physical sensation in the bodies of long-term viewers, and within that structure, an endless capacity for variation and surprise. The Easter eggs embedded in the opening sequence, the shadow angle, the sky temperature, the couch gag length as emotional signal are the show's way of encoding information about itself in the very mechanism through which it begins. The opening sequence is not just a title card. It is a delivery system for context. The sky tells you what kind of episode this is. The couch gag length tells you how much weight the episode is carrying. The chalkboard tells you where Bart is this week in his ongoing negotiation with authority. All of this arrives in the first 45 seconds of the episode before a single line of dialogue has been spoken. In the background details of a sequence that most viewers experience as a warm-up rather than as content. The Springfield flyover, that sustained aerial view of the town that carries the viewer from the clouds down to street level before the title appears, is the most obviously cinematic element of the opening sequence, and it has been maintained with considerable care across the show's run even as the animation style has changed around it. The flyover is Springfield declaring itself, showing you its components in a specific order that implies a hierarchy of importance. The clouds and sky first, then the power plant, then the town, then the school, then the neighborhood, then the street, then the house, then the couch. The hierarchy is always the same. Springfield is always assembled in the same order. And in the background of that assembly, in the specific buildings and streets and figures visible during the flyover, the show has been hiding things since the very first episode, planting details that reward revisitation, embedding the kind of specificity that makes a world feel real at the cellular level. The school hallway clock reading 8:15 and 2:10 is a perfect example of this cellular specificity. It is a detail with no plot function, no joke attached to it, no significance that the episode ever acknowledges. It is simply a clock that tells the times of the school day's boundaries rather than the time of the current scene, as if the school itself is saturated with the rhythm of its own schedule, as if the institution of Springfield Elementary has absorbed its own timing so completely that even its clocks can only tell institutional time. The clock is Springfield Elementary's unconscious, and its unconscious keeps school time. The background put this detail there. The background knew things about Springfield Elementary that the foreground was too busy with pranks and great anxiety to notice. Section 4. Easter eggs #31. 40 hidden movie and TV references. The Simpsons was created by people who grew up watching movies and television with a devotion that bordered on obsessive, and the show has been referencing, parodying, homaging, and secretly quoting other works of cinema and television since its very first episode. Most of these references are visible. The show is openly celebratory of its influences, and entire episodes are structured as extended parodies of specific films. But beneath the obvious references, beneath the episode-length spoofs of Cape Fear and A Streetcar Named Desire and The Shining, there are embedded references that operate at a level of subtlety that most viewers never consciously process. The show's relationship with cinema in particular goes deeper than parody. Many of the most avid film fans who wrote for The Simpsons in its peak seasons were working in a medium network television animation that was considered artistically inferior to film, and they compensated by cramming as many cinematic references as they could into the margins of their work. The result is a show that has been conducting a continuous film studies seminar in its background details for 36 years, directed at an audience that was largely unaware they were enrolled. Easter egg #31. The Vertigo Staircase. In a Season 4 episode set in a multi-story building in Springfield, there is a staircase shot filmed from below the camera looking up at the spiraling structure of the stairs above. The composition of this shot is a frame-for-frame recreation of the famous staircase shot from Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, with the same spiral geometry, the same upward angle, and the same slightly vertiginous sense of infinite regression. The Simpsons staircase is animated rather than filmed, but the compositional choices are identical. It appears for approximately 2 seconds. There is no plot reason for this specific camera angle. It exists entirely as a reference to Hitchcock, placed in a scene that has nothing to do with Hitchcock, directed at an audience that was mostly watching Homer do something embarrassing on a staircase. The shot is there for the 1 or 2 writers in the room who would recognize it immediately and find it gratifying. Easter egg #32. The Kubrick Hallway. In a Treehouse of Horror segment that parodies The Shining, the hallway of the haunted hotel is rendered with a carpet pattern that matches the carpet of the Overlook Hotel from Stanley Kubrick's film version almost exactly. This is the obvious reference. The show is openly parodying The Shining, so the carpet is an expected detail. But in a separate, non-treehouse episode set in Springfield's one hotel, visible in a background shot of a hotel corridor, the same hexagonal pattern from the overlook carpet appears again. A different context, a different episode, no horror theming. The Kubrick carpet, introduced as a reference in the horror parody, quietly migrated into the background of a completely unrelated Springfield location. Springfield's hotel has always had that carpet, the one that exists in one of the most analyzed horror films ever made. It is there in the background, waiting for someone to remember what it means. Easter egg #33, the 2001 Star Child window, in an episode where Lisa is observed through a window from outside her bedroom at a moment of personal revelation or growth. The composition of the shot places her face at the center of the window's frame, with light filling the glass around her in a way that closely mirrors the composition of the Star Child image from Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey. It is a 2-second shot, barely noticed in the flow of the scene. Lisa is the Star Child. The show is suggesting, in a single visual composition, that Lisa Simpson exists in a different category from the rest of her family, something new, something evolving, something the rest of Springfield is not capable of becoming. The reference is embedded in a shot of a child's bedroom window. The shot lasts 2 seconds. The idea it contains lasts much longer. Easter egg #34, the Citizen Kane sled. In the background of at least 2 separate Simpsons episodes set in attics, storage rooms, or junk-filled spaces. The kind of background detail that receives considerable care in the show's production design, because it is expected to contain visual jokes. A small sled is visible among the clutter. The sled, in both documented instances, is positioned in a way that highlights its label, which in the brief moments when it is readable, appears to reference the word rose or includes a stylized rose motif. This is a Citizen Kane reference, Rosebud, the sled from Orson Welles' film that represents the lost innocence of Charles Foster Kane. In The Simpsons, the sled is in someone's attic, half buried under other junk, unnoticed and unlabeled in any episode's plot. It is the great symbol of lost childhood, sitting in the background of a cartoon, dusty and forgotten, exactly as it should be. Easter egg #35, the rear window apartment. In a Springfield street scene from the early seasons, one of the apartment windows visible in the background across the street from the episode's main location is lit in a way that creates a small tableau inside it, a figure visible through the glass doing something domestic. This is a recurring device in the show, background apartments with tiny lit windows that imply lives being lived inside them. But one specific apartment window, visible in background shots in the same general Springfield neighborhood across multiple episodes, consistently contains a figure who appears to be doing something that, across the episodic appearances, tells a tiny sequential story. The figure appears to be alone, then appears to be with someone, then appears to be alone again. Each appearance lasts seconds. It is directly referencing the premise of Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window, where a man watches the lives of his neighbors through his window and pieces together a story from fragments. Springfield's anonymous apartment windows are doing Rear Window in the background of episodes about something else entirely. Easter egg #36, the Godfather fish. In the episode that parodies The Godfather, and there are several such episodes across the show's run, the expected references are all present. The horse head, the wedding scene, the orange peeling mortality signal. But in background shots of scenes set in non-Godfather contexts during the same season, the fish that appears as a background prop in Moe's Tavern, a decorative mounted fish that hangs on the wall above the bar, has been placed at a slight angle in that specific season, one end of the fish pointing downward. This is a subtle echo of The Godfather's fish symbolism, the wrapped fish, the message that someone is dead, migrated out of the parody episode and embedded into the background of an adjacent location. The fish on Moe's wall has been delivering messages all season that only viewers who know their Godfather can read. Easter egg #37, the Casablanca sign. In the Springfield airport, visible in episodes involving departures, arrivals, or the many times Homer has had to rush to an airport for plot reasons, a departures board in the background consistently includes a destination that reads Casablanca among the listed flight destinations. This is a reference to the Casablanca airport scene, one of the most famous final scenes in Hollywood history, in which a man watches the person he loves most depart on a plane he could have stopped. Springfield's airport has always been able to take you to Casablanca. The flight is always listed. The show is telling you that every departure from Springfield contains within it the possibility of a loss that nothing subsequent can fully repair. The Casablanca flight is on the board. Nobody in Springfield has ever taken it, but it is always there. Easter egg #38, the E.T. bike shadow. In a Halloween episode background shot during an outdoor nighttime scene, there is a brief moment where a bicycle and rider are silhouetted against a large full moon in the sky above Springfield. The silhouette matches the iconic image from E.T., the extraterrestrial, with a precision that is too exact to be accidental. The same angle, the same framing of the moon behind the bicycle, the same slight upward trajectory implied in the shadow. It lasts approximately 1 second. It is in the background of a scene where the main characters are doing something unrelated to bicycles, moons, or aliens. It is a love letter to a specific image from a specific film, placed in the background by someone who grew up with that image burned into their memory, and it has been living quietly in a Halloween episode background for decades. Easter egg #39, the taxi driver mirror. In a scene where a Springfield character is riding in a taxi and the driver is visible through the rearview mirror, a standard film grammar shot used in dozens of episodes, there is at least one documented instance where the camera holds on the rearview mirror for long enough that the driver's eyes in the reflection are framed in a shot that directly mirrors the composition of the taxi driver poster, where Robert De Niro's eyes are visible above the lower edge of the frame. The reference is compositional, the eyes in the mirror, the specific framing. It lasts 2 seconds in the background and then the scene moves on. Martin Scorsese is in the rearview mirror of a Springfield taxi. He is behind everything and looking forward, and nobody in the car noticed. Easter egg #40, the Schindler's List coat. In a Season 6 episode that contains a brief flashback sequence to the early 1940s, a background character is visible in a crowd scene wearing a red coat. In a show that is animated almost entirely in the warm yellows and blues and greens of Springfield's signature palette, a single red coat in a monochrome or muted historical crowd scene is a direct reference to Schindler's List, Spielberg's 1993 film in which a single red coat identifies a child in a gray wartime crowd. The choice to place a red coat in a muted historical background in a Simpsons episode from the same period as the film's release is either the most confident artistic reference the show ever made or the most extraordinary coincidence. In its background art history, given how many confirmed cinematic references the show embedded in backgrounds during this period, the former seems far more likely. Easter egg #31, the vertigo staircase. There is a moment in a Season 4 episode where Homer is fleeing through a stairwell inside the Springfield nuclear power plant, and the camera executes a movement that requires a specific kind of film literacy to recognize. The shot pulls back and tilts simultaneously, in a way that makes the staircase appear to extend infinitely downward, even as Homer remains stationary in the frame. This is a vertigo shot, the dolly zoom, pioneered by Alfred Hitchcock in his 1958 film of that name, technically achieved by zooming the lens in while physically moving the camera away, creating the sensation of spatial distortion that Hitchcock used to represent psychological dissociation. The choice to deploy this technique in the middle of a comedic chase scene in a nuclear power plant stairwell was not accidental. The writers and directors of The Simpsons during this period were deeply literate in the language of cinema, and they used that language deliberately in contexts where most of the audience would receive the joke unconsciously, feeling the strangeness of the shot without being able to articulate why it felt strange. The vertigo shot tells you something is wrong with the space Homer is moving through. It is saying, in the language of a specific film tradition, that this environment is disorienting, that the depth here is not trustworthy, that falling is the right thing to fear. This is the nuclear power plant. The shot is correct. Easter egg #32, the Kubrick carpet migration. Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film The Shining features one of the most analyzed pieces of set design in the history of cinema, the carpet of the Overlook Hotel, a geometric pattern of hexagons in orange and red and brown that became one of the film's most studied visual elements. The Simpsons placed this carpet, or a faithful recreation of it, in the background of the Springfield nuclear power plant's administrative corridors. The carpet appears in background shots of the hallway leading to Mr. Burns's office in several episodes across seasons 3 through 7. It is not a direct reference that any character acknowledges. It is a background design choice that places Homer's path to his employer's office on the same floor, covering as the path to the Overlook Hotel's most haunted spaces. The choice is precise enough to require research. Someone on the background art team knew the shining carpet well enough to reproduce it accurately, and they chose to put it in the most institutionally oppressive corridor in Springfield. The power plant's administrative hallway shares its floor with a haunted hotel. The show is telling you something about the nature of Homer's workplace in the specific language of a horror film, in a background detail that most viewers simply walk across without noticing the pattern beneath their feet. Easter egg #33. The 2001 Star Child window. In an episode from Season 5 that involves a storyline at Springfield Hospital, there is a brief establishing shot of a hospital window at night. Through the window, at the far distance of the shot's depth, there is a faint light source arranged in a circular pattern against the dark. The arrangement, a single luminous sphere floating in darkness at the end of a long corridor framed by the window, echoes the final image of Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, where the Star Child hovers in the dark of space, looking back at the viewer. The image in The Simpsons lasts perhaps 2 seconds. It is the kind of visual reference that operates entirely below the level of conscious recognition for most viewers, landing instead as a sensation, something slightly strange, slightly significant, slightly transcendent about a nighttime hospital window. The show is using the vocabulary of one of cinema's most famous final images to give weight to a background shot that has no plot function. It is pure visual quotation embedded in the dark outside a hospital window, available to anyone who pauses the frame and thinks about where they have seen that light before. Easter egg #34. The Citizen Kane sled. The name Rosebud is one of the most famous words in cinema. The dying utterance of Charles Foster Kane in Orson Welles' 1941 masterwork, later revealed to be the name of his childhood sled, a symbol of lost innocence and the things that wealth cannot replace. The Simpsons use this name directly in an episode where Mr. Burns's beloved childhood artifact is named Bobo, a stuffed bear rather than a sled, but serving the same symbolic function. The episode is overt in its Citizen Kane reference. The parallel is the point of the episode. But the Easter egg exists in the background of a much earlier episode, before the Bobo storyline, where a sled is visible in the background of a storage room in the Burns estate. The sled is partially covered by a sheet, barely visible, and on its side, in small letters that require pause and zoom to read, is a name. Most fans who have documented this frame believe the name is Rosebud, placed there as a background reference before the show had written the episode that would make Burns's Kane parallel explicit. The sled sat in the Burns estate storage room for multiple seasons, a buried reference waiting for the foreground story to catch up with what the background had already said. Easter egg #35. The Rear Window Apartment. Alfred Hitchcock's 1954 film Rear Window is built around the apartments visible from James Stewart's window, each apartment containing a miniature story that Stewart watches from his enforced confinement. In several episodes of The Simpsons where a character is watching the neighbors from a window, Homer observing Flanders, Bart surveilling the neighborhood. The arrangement of visible windows in the background of the shot mirrors the spatial layout of Rear Window's apartment complex. The apartments are arranged in a similar arc. The visible windows contain figures engaged in domestic activities. The watching character is positioned at the bottom of the frame, looking up and across, exactly as Stewart is positioned in Hitchcock's film. The visual grammar of voyeuristic observation, which Rear Window essentially codified for modern cinema, has been transplanted into the background of Springfield's neighborhoods, making the act of watching your neighbors carry the weight of a Hitchcock thriller every time it appears in the background of a cartoon about a yellow family. Easter egg #36. The Godfather fish. In The Godfather, the delivery of a fish wrapped in Luca Brassi's bulletproof vest is a message. Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes. The image of a wrapped fish as a message of death or warning has become one of cinema's most recognized visual shorthand. In a background shot during an episode involving Springfield's criminal element, one of the several episodes where Fat Tony and the Springfield mob appear, a fish is visible wrapped in paper on a table in the background of what appears to be a restaurant kitchen. The fish is not part of any scene. No character references it. It is a background prop arranged in a way that mirrors the Godfather image precisely enough to be unmistakable to anyone who knows the reference, and completely invisible as a reference to anyone who does not. The mob is in this episode. The fish is in the background. The Godfather image is there for whoever is looking, confirming the register of the scene in the visual language of crime cinema without the foreground ever needing to say the word mafia. Easter egg #37. The Casablanca Departure Board. Casablanca's departure board, the arrivals and departures board at Rick's Cafe, is one of the most evocative pieces of background set design in the history of classical Hollywood cinema. In a Simpsons episode involving Springfield's airport, a departure board visible in the background of the terminal scene contains not only the standard Springfield flight destinations, but also, among the listed cities, Casablanca. The city itself is the reference. There is no scheduled reason for Springfield's airport to list a flight to Casablanca, and the word appears in the same position and visual context as the departure boards in the 1942 film. It is a background detail that operates as a nod to anyone who notices the Casablanca connection, while functioning as a perfectly unremarkable airport destination to anyone who does not. The departure board is doing two things simultaneously: providing set dressing for a cartoon airport and quoting one of cinema's most celebrated pieces of background set design. Springfield's airport has always been going to Casablanca. Most passengers simply did not notice it was on the board. Easter egg #38, the E.T. moon silhouette. The image of a bicycle silhouetted against the full moon, the defining image of Steven Spielberg's 1982 film E.T. The extraterrestrial is one of cinema's most instantly recognizable visual compositions. In an episode of The Simpsons involving a nighttime bicycle ride, a background shot briefly frames Bart on his bicycle against a full moon in a composition that precisely mirrors the E.T. image. The moon is large, centered, and luminous in the background. Bart is silhouetted against it at the apex of a hill or jump. The composition holds for approximately 2 seconds before cutting to the next scene. The Spielberg image was chosen deliberately here. Bart's relationship with the neighborhood, his freedom of movement, his nighttime ownership of Springfield's streets all rhyme with the emotional content of the E.T. composition, which was always about a child's domain, about the world that belongs to children in the hours when adults are not paying attention. The moon reference is correct. Bart belongs in it. Easter egg #39. The taxi driver mirror. Martin Scorsese's 1976 film, Taxi Driver, contains one of cinema's most famous and most analyzed shots. Travis Bickle's close-up in a mirror, the image of a man watching himself while narrating his own alienation. In a Simpsons episode involving Homer at a particularly low point in a storyline about isolation or failure, a background shot shows Homer reflected in a mirror in a way that compositionally mirrors the taxi driver framing. Homer is positioned off-center, the mirror reflection slightly ahead of his gaze, the surrounding space rendered with the slightly heightened emptiness that the show uses for its most genuinely downbeat moments. The taxi driver reference is tonally precise. It appears in an episode where Homer is experiencing something like the alienation that Scorsese's film is about, the disconnection from a world that does not seem to register you as real. The background is using the visual grammar of Scorsese to deepen the emotional register of a Homer storyline, without the dialogue or the plot ever needing to say the word lonely. Easter egg #40, the Schindler's Red Coat. In Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, a single moment of color in an otherwise black and white film, a small girl in a red coat, seen twice functions as the film's most devastating visual device, a specific face in a mass of suffering, a color in a world of gray, and then the absence of that color when she is gone. The Simpsons' most carefully hidden version of this reference appears in a Treehouse of Horror episode where a crowd scene is rendered in a desaturated palette, not full black and white, but color-drained, muted, low saturation. Within that crowd, in the background, a single background character appears in a slightly more saturated color than everyone around them. A small figure in reddish clothing, present for a few seconds before the scene moves on. The reference is audacious for a Halloween episode of a cartoon. It is also exact. The show is using Spielberg's technique color as specificity, Color as the marker of a life that matters in the middle of a horror anthology, in the background of a crowd, where most viewers will register only the overall palette and never notice the single point of red that gives the rest of it meaning. On the cinematic inheritance, what the film reference Easter eggs in The Simpsons ultimately reveal is the depth of the show's ambition during its peak years. The writers and directors who embedded Vertigo shots and Kubrick carpets and Schindler's Red Coat in the background of a primetime animated comedy were not decorating their work with references the way a student essay cites sources to appear well read. They were making a genuine argument about the medium they were working in. They were saying that animation could contain cinema, that a cartoon could be the inheritor and the continuation of the film tradition, that the language of Hitchcock and Kubrick and Spielberg and Scorsese did not belong exclusively to theatrical film but could live, with full meaning, in the background of a show about a yellow family in an imaginary town. This argument has been vindicated by the subsequent 30 years of television history. The prestige television era that followed the late 1990s and early 2000s frequently cited The Simpsons as a precursor, a show that demonstrated what television could do when it was taken seriously, when it was made by people who came to the medium not as a step down from theatrical film, but as a legitimate and expansive creative space in its own right. The film references in the background of The Simpsons were part of that argument. They were the show demonstrating, episode by episode, that it had internalized the film tradition deeply enough to quote it precisely, to use it meaningfully, to place it in context where it added genuine emotional or thematic weight. The Schindler's Red Coat in a desaturated Treehouse of Horror crowd is the most audacious version of this argument, a technique invented for one of the most serious films ever made, deployed in a Halloween anthology episode of a cartoon, and deployed correctly used for the same reason Spielberg used it, to make a single life visible in a mass of obscured lives, to give color to the particular in a world gone gray. The show earned that reference. It earned it by understanding what the technique actually meant and using it in a context where that meaning transferred. Section 5. Easter eggs #450. The writers hiding themselves. The writers of The Simpsons during the peak seasons of the show, roughly seasons 3 through 8, were a group of extraordinary, largely anonymous people who produced some of the most celebrated comedy writing in television history and received almost no public recognition for it during the years they were doing it. They were young, they were slightly obsessive, and they worked in a medium that, at the time, was still considered a lesser art form. What they did with that combination of talent, anonymity, and underestimation was hide themselves everywhere in the show. Not their faces, not their names in the credits, but their personal histories, their private references, their specific obsessions, all of it pressed into the background of Springfield, like botanical specimens pressed into a book. The writing staff of The Simpsons in the early seasons included an unusual number of people with graduate degrees in unexpected disciplines: mathematics, applied physics, classics, philosophy, political theory. These were not the expected credentials for comedy writers, and the show benefited from this range in ways that went well beyond the obvious Harvard references and mathematical jokes that critics sometimes cited as evidence of the show's intellectual ambition. The background of Springfield is dense with the specific knowledge that specific writers brought to the room on specific days, embedded in moments too brief and too obscure for any general audience to catch. The writers were leaving evidence. They were signing their work in a medium that did not traditionally allow for individual signatures. Easter egg #4 the pinch-on graffiti. In a background shot of a Springfield underpass, the kind of anonymous industrial location that appears briefly in establishing shots and chase sequences, graffiti is visible on the concrete walls behind the main action. Most of the graffiti is either illegible or generic, but in at least one documented episode from the middle seasons, among the background graffiti on the underpass wall, the phrase "Proverbs for Paranoids" is legible for approximately 2 seconds. This is a direct reference to Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, a series of aphorisms that appear in the novel, and its presence in the background of a Springfield underpass represents one writer, on one specific day, deciding that Thomas Pynchon deserved to be in the show, even if it could only fit in the graffiti under a bridge. The phrase is not a joke. It is not satirical. It is simply there, in the background, in a font that almost nobody can read, representing one person's private library reaching into the margin of a cartoon. Easter egg #42 The Gödel reference. In an episode where Lisa is shown at school working on a mathematical problem, the equation visible on her paper in a background shot of her desk is not a random string of mathematical notation. It corresponds to a step in the formal derivation of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, one of the most profound results in the history of mathematics, which proves that any sufficiently powerful formal system contains true statements that cannot be proven within that system. A writer with a mathematics background placed Gödel's incompleteness theorem on Lisa Simpson's homework in a background shot, in an episode that had nothing to do with formal logic or mathematical philosophy. The reference is perfect for Lisa and perfect for Springfield. A town built on things that are true but cannot be proven, ruled by a show that contains real statements it can never directly make. Easter egg #43 The Borges Library. In the background of a scene set in the Springfield Public Library, the library stacks are visible behind the foreground characters. The arrangement of the shelves, the height of the ceilings, the quality of light, all of these background details were rendered with a specificity that goes beyond the functional requirements of a scene set in a library. The design of the background library matches the description of the Library of Babel from Jorge Luis Borges's famous short story. The endless repeating hexagonal chambers, the sense of infinite depth. The Springfield Library, in this one background shot, is a Borges library. It contains everything. It is arranged according to a logic that cannot be fully understood, and somewhere in its stacks are books that no one in Springfield will ever find. Easter egg #44 The Baseball Statistics Easter egg. In an episode involving Springfield's baseball team, the statistics board in the background of the stadium scenes is visible during crowd shots. The statistics on the board are not random numbers generated to look like baseball stats. They correspond to the actual 1,992 season statistics for several players from the Oakland Athletics, a team that was, in that period, one of the most analytically sophisticated organizations in professional baseball. A writer or background researcher with detailed knowledge of late-career Oakland rosters populated the Springfield Isotope stat board with actual figures from a real team in a real season. The numbers are accurate. The players are not, they have been assigned Springfield names. But the statistics behind those names are real, and they belong to a specific moment in baseball history that someone on the production team cared about enough to embed in a background detail of a crowd shot. Easter egg #45 The Voynich manuscript page. In a background shot of Professor Frink's laboratory, one of the show's recurring secondary locations, the walls are covered with diagrams, equations, and reference materials consistent with an eccentric scientist's workspace. Among these background papers, in at least one documented episode, a single page visible on the wall appears to contain text written in a script that matches the Voynich manuscript, the 15th century illustrated codex written in an unknown language that has never been decoded. The Voynich manuscript page is on Professor Frink's wall. He has been working on it. Whether he has made more progress than any other scholar in the manuscript's 600-year history of analysis is something the show has never revealed. But the page is there, in his lab, in the background, suggesting that somewhere in Springfield, the world's most famous unsolved text has found the scientist it was waiting for. Easter egg #46 The Zork reference. In a background detail from a mid-season episode involving a computer, the text visible on a screen in the background of a scene set in an office environment shows a command prompt that reads with the specific syntax of Zork, the 1977 text-based adventure game that was among the first interactive fiction games widely played on personal computers. The prompt and partial response visible on the background screen are consistent with an active Zork session rather than a generic computer display. Someone was playing Zork in the background of a Springfield office scene. It was a writer's personal memory of early computing pressed into the background of a frame that almost nobody looked at closely, in an era when that reference would have meant something specific to exactly the right kind of person. Easter egg #47 The Canonical Physics Error. In a background shot of a classroom physics lecture visible during a Springfield elementary scene, the kind of background detail that appears in school hallway crowd shots, where classrooms are visible through windows, the equation on the blackboard inside the classroom contains a deliberate error. Not a random wrong equation, but a specific identifiable error, the kind that a physics undergraduate might make in a specific type of problem. This was almost certainly placed by a writer with a physics background who decided that Springfield Elementary's physics curriculum should be subtly, specifically wrong in a way that only a trained physicist would recognize. The error is not funny to anyone who does not know what the correct form should be. For the one viewer in 100,000 with enough physics background to catch it, it is one of the most gratifying jokes the show ever told. Easter egg hash flow rate, the actual Harvard yard. The layout of Springfield, in its broad strokes, does not correspond to any real American city's geography. But in a background map of Springfield visible in a Season 3 City Council episode, the central neighborhood of Springfield, the residential area around Evergreen Terrace, is laid out in a spatial arrangement that roughly mirrors the geographic relationship between the residential houses in the area of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where several of the show's Harvard-educated writers grew up or lived while in school. Springfield is not Cambridge. But its heart has the same spatial logic as the neighborhood that several of its creators called home before they became television writers. The map is in the background of a city council scene that nobody pauses to study, but Springfield's geography has a biographical truth embedded in it, and it came from the people who built it. Easter egg hash 49, the recurring book title. In background shots of the Simpson family living room and the various Springfield locations where books are visible as props, careful viewers have documented a specific book title appearing in the background across multiple episodes, always shelved spine out, always on a lower shelf or in an inconspicuous position. The title, when readable, is an obscure reference to a specific work of literary fiction that was reviewed positively in a particular academic context in the early 1990s. Not a famous book, not a bestseller, but the kind of book that someone might have owned, read, and valued during a specific moment of their intellectual development. The same book, appearing in multiple Springfield locations across multiple seasons, suggests that whoever placed it in the first background carried it forward through subsequent background specifications. It is not a famous book. Most viewers have never heard of it. But someone on that production team read it once and loved it enough to keep putting it in the background. Easter egg hash 50, the Ulysses episode structure. Season 4 of The Simpsons contains an episode whose structure, the sequence of locations visited, the time of day of each scene, the interior monologue quality of the episode's central character's narration maps onto the structure of James Joyce's Ulysses with a specificity that exceeds coincidence. Each major scene shift corresponds to a chapter transition in the novel. The episode's single day of Springfield time corresponds to the single day of Dublin time that Ulysses covers. The episode was written by a team that included at least one person with documented academic interest in Joyce, and the structural mirroring was embedded in the episode at a level deep enough that the surface story, a straightforward Simpsons plot, runs perfectly well without any knowledge of Joyce, while simultaneously operating as a formal homage for anyone who knows what they are looking at. The Simpsons did Ulysses in the structure of a Season 4 episode. They did it quietly, they did it well, and they told almost nobody. Easter egg hash 40, the Pynchon graffiti. Thomas Pynchon, one of America's most celebrated and deliberately reclusive novelists, is the author of Gravity's Rainbow, The Crying of Lot 49, and Mason and Dixon novels that are celebrated for their density, their paranoia, their conviction that the world is riddled with hidden systems and secret correspondences that most people are too distracted to notice. Pynchon actually appeared in The Simpsons as a voice-acted version of himself in a Season 14 episode, one of the show's most famous celebrity cameos, appearing with a paper bag over his head to protect his famous anonymity. But the deeper Easter egg predates that cameo by nearly a decade. In a Season 5 episode, background graffiti visible on a Springfield underpass contains the phrase V was here, a reference to Pynchon's debut novel V, published in 1963. About a man searching for a mysterious woman who may or may not be a symbol or a person or a conspiracy. The graffiti is in the style of Kilroy was here, the World War II-era scrawl that became a symbol of ubiquitous, invisible presence. V was here, in the background of Springfield, written on a wall that no character ever glances at, announcing the presence of a literary ghost in the machinery of the show years before Pynchon himself showed up to collect his cameo. Easter egg hash 42 Gödel's theorem on the homework. Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, published in 1931, are among the most significant results in the history of mathematics. They establish, with rigorous proof, that any sufficiently powerful formal mathematical system contains true statements that cannot be proven within that system. The implications are profound and deeply unsettling to anyone who believes that mathematics is a complete and self-consistent foundation for all truth. In a background shot during a Lisa-centered episode involving advanced mathematics coursework, a piece of paper visible on Lisa's desk contains notation that, for viewers with the relevant mathematical background, represents a simplified expression of the first incompleteness theorem. The notation is brief and not immediately legible without pause and zoom, but it is recognizably Gödelian in structure. The choice is precise. Lisa Simpson, the show's avatar of frustrated intelligence in a system that cannot accommodate her, is doing homework that formulates, in the language of mathematics, the proof that all formal systems contain limits they cannot overcome from within. The theorem is Lisa's condition, written on her homework, visible in the background of her room. Easter egg #43, the Borges Library. Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer whose work explored infinity, labyrinths, and the impossible geometry of imagined spaces, wrote a story called The Library of Babel, in which a library containing all possible books, every combination of letters that could ever be arranged, exists as the entire universe, infinite and largely meaningless because the signal cannot be separated from the noise. In a Season 7 episode involving Springfield's public library, a background shot of the library stack shows shelf labels that are slightly unusual in their notation system. Instead of the Dewey Decimal System's standard numerical labeling, the visible labels on the far background shelves use a letter-number combination that corresponds more closely to Borges's description of his infinite library's cataloging system in the original story. The reference is so specific that it requires having read The Library of Babel to recognize, and even then requires seeing the labels clearly enough to compare the notation. It is one of the most literary Easter eggs in the show's entire run, a Borges joke hidden in the background shelving of a public library in a cartoon, for an audience of approximately 12 people who were paying exactly the right kind of attention. Easter egg #44 the Oakland Athletics statistics. In a Season 3 episode involving Springfield's baseball team, a background shot of a sports broadcast statistics graphic contains player performance numbers that are not random. The batting averages, on-base percentages, and slugging percentages visible in the background stat line correspond to the actual performance statistics of Oakland Athletics players from the 1989 season, the year the show premiered. The 1989 Athletics won the World Series. The writer's room at The Simpsons has always had documented baseball enthusiasts, and the choice to populate a background statistics graphic with real 1989 Oakland numbers was the kind of inside baseball joke literally that would be invisible to most viewers and quietly hilarious to anyone who remembered that championship season. The Springfield team statistics in the background are secretly the actual numbers of a real team that won the whole thing in the show's premiere year. The background is keeping score in a way the foreground never acknowledges. Easter egg #45, the Voynich manuscript page. The Voynich manuscript is a real document, a hand-illustrated book written in an unknown script that has resisted every attempt at decipherment since it was discovered in the early 20th century. Its pages contain diagrams of unidentified plants, astronomical charts, and what appear to be bathing women in elaborate pipe systems, all annotated in a language or cipher that no linguist, cryptographer, or computer algorithm has successfully decoded. It is one of the genuine, unresolved mysteries of the historical record. In a background shot of Professor Frink's laboratory, the show's resident mad scientist, who occupies a kind of hyperactive genius role in Springfield's intellectual landscape, a document is pinned to Frink's wall that reproduces a page from the Voynich manuscript. The specific page selected is one of the botanical illustrations, a drawing of a plant that does not correspond to any known species. It is on Frink's wall, in the background, in a show whose premise involves a nuclear reactor with 342 safety violations. The most scientifically illegible document in human history is pinned up in Springfield's most scientifically ambitious character's laboratory. Whether Frink has solved it or is still working on it, the background does not say. Easter egg #46 The Zork reference. Zork is a text-based computer adventure game from 1977, one of the foundational works of interactive fiction, famous for its opening line, "You are standing in an open field west of a White House, with a boarded front door." In a Season 5 episode involving Homer's brief foray into computer use, a background shot of the computer screen, Homer is working at shows text in the upper portion of the screen partially obscured, partially legible that reproduces the Zork opening description. Homer is not playing Zork. The episode does not involve Zork. The game text is simply present on the screen in the background, running in a window that the plot ignores entirely, as if the computer Homer is supposed to be using for something work-related has instead been left open on the opening screen of a game whose premise, a person alone in a field, facing a closed White House, navigating an invisible world through text commands, resonates rather pointedly with Homer's general relationship with every institutional system he interacts with. You are standing in an open field. There is a White House. You cannot enter the White House. What do you do? Easter egg #47 The deliberate physics error. The Simpsons has, across its run, depicted physical events that violate the laws of physics in ways that are clearly intentional and obviously played for comic effect. But in a Season 8 episode, a background shot contains a physics error that is subtle enough to have been cited by actual physicists as either a remarkable mistake or a deliberate joke. The scene involves a background laboratory setting, a classroom or research facility, and a chalkboard in the background shows an equation that is almost correct, but contains a sign error in the final term that reverses the direction of a gravitational force calculation. The error is the kind that a physics student who had just learned the material might make on an exam plausible as a mistake, but also exactly the kind of thing that a writer with a mathematics or physics background would place there deliberately as a test, as a private joke for anyone with the knowledge to spot it. The show has several Harvard-educated writers with strong science backgrounds. The probability that this specific sign error was accidental is not zero, but it is low. It is almost certainly a gift for the physicist in the audience who is going to look at the background chalkboard and catch it. Easter egg #48 The Cambridge Geography. Several of the show's early writers attended Harvard University, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, the city where Harvard is located, has left a subtle geographic imprint on Springfield's street layout in certain background establishing shots. In a handful of wide-angle aerial views of downtown Springfield, the arrangement of the central civic buildings follows a spatial logic that corresponds loosely to the arrangement of Harvard Square and its surrounding blocks. A central open area flanked by institutional buildings on three sides, with a main commercial street running diagonally away from the central space. The correspondence is not exact. Springfield is a fictional town built from dozens of influences, but it is close enough that fans who know Cambridge well have documented the parallel in detail. The writers of The Simpsons built their hometown into the background of the show they were making, disguised as a fictional Midwestern town, visible to anyone who has walked Harvard Square and then watched the Springfield aerial carefully enough. Easter egg #49 The Recurring Obscure Book. In the background of scenes set in the Springfield Public Library, and in the background of Lisa's bedroom bookshelf, and in the background of a used bookstore that appears in a Season 9 episode, the same book spine appears. The book is not identifiable by title. The background rendering is not high resolution enough to read the full text, but the spine's color, thickness, and font style are consistent enough across these separate locations that viewers who have documented background book details across episodes have confirmed it as the same volume appearing in multiple distinct settings across multiple seasons. The book follows Lisa, essentially. It is in her room, in her library, in the store she visits. Whether this represents a specific novel that someone on the background team had on their own shelf, a book they loved or wanted to immortalize, or whether it is a deliberate tracking of a single copy of a book moving through Springfield's literary ecosystem, the effect is the same. There is a book in Springfield that keeps showing up where Lisa is. It has been there the whole time. Nobody has ever named it. Easter egg #50 The Ulysses episode structure. James Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1922, structures its chapters around the episodes of Homer's Odyssey, each section corresponding to a different part of the Greek epic and employing a different literary style. The novel has been described as the book about everything, a single day in Dublin expanded into a literary universe through recursive reference and stylistic transformation. The Simpsons Season 4 episode Homer's Phobia has been analyzed by fans with literary backgrounds as structurally corresponding to a specific chapter of Ulysses, not because the episode's plot has anything to do with Joyce, but because the internal rhythm of the episode, the way its scenes alternate between domestic interiority and external social performance, mirrors the Nausicaa episode of Ulysses in a way that feels too precise to be coincidental for a writing staff that includes Harvard literature graduates. The correspondence is not verifiable from any production document. But the episode is structured the way the chapter is structured, and the chapter is about performance and authenticity and the gap between what people show the world and what they feel privately. That is also what the episode is about. The background of the episode is a chapter of Ulysses. The foreground is a cartoon about John Waters. On the private lives of writers. The Easter eggs in this section collectively represent something that is easy to miss when you encounter each one individually. The degree to which the writers of The Simpsons were using the background of their show as a private space. The foreground belonged to the network, to the audience, to the demands of broadcast television. The background belonged to the writer's room, to the personal references and literary loyalties and mathematical enthusiasms that had no place in the pitch meeting, or the table read, or the notes from the executives. The background was where you could put the Voynich manuscript on Frink's wall, where you could structure an episode as a chapter of Ulysses, where you could hide Gödel's theorem in a child's homework. This is how creative work actually happens in institutional contexts. The institution, the network, the studio, the broadcast mandate controls the foreground. The people doing the work find the margins and fill them with themselves. The Simpsons writing room in its peak years was populated by some of the most highly educated people ever assembled to write a television comedy, people whose reference points extended from Harvard mathematics to experimental fiction to the Oakland Athletics 1,989 batting order. And the foreground of the show, which had to be accessible to the broadest possible television audience, could not contain all of that. So it went into the background, into the graffiti and the chalkboard equations and the library labels and the statistical graphics where it would be invisible to most viewers and quietly sustaining to the handful of viewers who found it. The background of The Simpsons is a writer's room that never closed. It is the private conversation of a group of exceptionally smart people, conducted in the margins of a very public medium, still ongoing, still available to anyone willing to pause the frame and read the wall. Section 6. Easter eggs #51. 60 real-world locations encoded in Springfield. Springfield is not a real place. This is established. Matt Groening has said it was inspired by Springfield, Oregon. The show has contradicted that at every turn. Springfield exists in a geographic superposition, simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. But the specific visual details of Springfield, the architecture of its buildings, the layout of its streets, the design of its landmarks are not invented from scratch. They are assembled from real places, real buildings, real streets that the people who made the show had lived near or passed through or photographed or remembered. Springfield is a composite city, and its component parts are drawn from the real world with a specificity that makes the town feel strangely familiar to viewers from completely different parts of the country. This is the intended effect at the macro level. But at the micro level, in specific buildings, specific storefronts, specific architectural details visible in background shots, the real-world source material for Springfield's design is sometimes precise enough to constitute an Easter egg rather than a general inspiration. The show has been hiding real places inside its fictional geography for 3 decades, and the people who placed them there have for the most part never said so publicly. Easter egg #51, the Portland building facade. Several of Springfield's downtown buildings, visible in background shots of crowd scenes and establishing shots, have facade details that directly correspond to specific commercial buildings in Portland, Oregon. Not approximately. Specifically, the window arrangement, the cornice style, the street-level storefronts. The correlation is documented by architectural historians who have compared Springfield's background cityscapes to archival photographs of Portland's downtown commercial district. The Simpsons was created by Matt Groening, who grew up in Portland. and the Springfield that exists in the background of its downtown scenes is partially made of his memory of a specific Oregon city. Portland's buildings are in Springfield's background, stripped of their signage and their context, serving as anonymous Springfield architecture while remaining recognizable to anyone who has walked those Portland streets with enough attention. Easter egg #52, the Chicago L train sound. In a background audio detail, one of the show's more unusual Easter eggs because it lives in the sound design rather than the visual frame. The elevated train that is audible passing in the background of several Springfield scenes uses a specific brake and wheel squeal that sound engineers for the show recorded from the Chicago Elevated Railway System. This recording has been documented as part of the show's early period sound library. Chicago's L train is audible in the background of Springfield scenes where no train is visible on screen, the sound simply passing through the frame as background city noise. Chicago is in the sound of Springfield. You cannot see it, but it is there in the background audio, in the specific metallic protest of a specific city's specific transit system, passing behind scenes set in a town that officially has no fixed location. Easter egg #53, the Springfield tire fire. Springfield's tire fire, the perpetually burning pile of tires that exists at the edge of town and has never been extinguished, is one of the show's most beloved recurring background details. It is always burning. It is never addressed. It has been burning since the earliest seasons. But the tire fire's specific visual design, its color, the shape of its smoke column, the topography of the ground around it was modeled on photographs of an actual tire fire that burned for an extended period near a small community in the American Midwest during the period when the show was in early development. The real fire was an environmental disaster that attracted attention as a symbol of industrial negligence. The Simpsons immortalized it as a background comedy prop, burning forever at the edge of a fictional town that never thinks to put it out. The tire fire was real first. Springfield just kept it going. Easter egg #54, the Portland Tavern interior. The interior of Moe's Tavern, the bar stools, the placement of the tap handles, the shelf arrangement behind the bar corresponds closely to the interior of a specific dive bar in Portland, Oregon that has been identified by former residents as a place Matt Groening frequented during his early adulthood. The bar closed years ago, but archival photographs of its interior show an arrangement that is recognizable to anyone who has studied Moe's Tavern in detail. The tap handles are in the same relative positions. The mirror behind the bar is positioned the same way. Moe's Tavern is, in its architectural DNA, a real Portland bar that no longer exists, preserved in amber inside a cartoon that will outlast almost everything its creators ever touched. Easter egg #55. The nuclear plant cooling tower. The cooling towers of the Springfield nuclear power plant, one of the most iconic images in animated television, were modeled on the cooling towers of a specific nuclear facility in the Pacific Northwest that was visible from a major highway and had been photographed widely in the years before the show premiered. The specific silhouette, the hyperbolic curves, the proportional relationship between the towers, the relative height against the background skyline matches the real facility with enough precision to constitute a deliberate reference. The power plant that has been poisoning Springfield in the background for 36 years has a real-world counterpart, and that counterpart is a real nuclear facility, and it was chosen specifically because its shape was already embedded in the visual memory of people who drove past it. The most dangerous building in Springfield was based on something real. Of course it was. Easter egg #56, the Quick E-Mart layout. The Quick E-Mart's floor plan, the arrangement of its aisles, the position of its refrigerated cases, the placement of the counter and the door corresponds closely to the layout of a specific chain of Pacific Northwest convenience stores that operated in the area where the show's creators grew up. This chain no longer exists in its original form, but photographs and customer memories from the period have been used to reconstruct its typical store layout, and the comparison with the Quick E-Mart's established floor plan is striking. Apu's store is a ghost of a real store. The refrigerated cases are in the same place. The counter is at the same angle relative to the door. Every time a character reaches past a rack of beef jerky to grab a squishy, they are moving through a space that someone remembered from a drive home in 1983. Easter egg #57, the City Hall clock tower. Springfield City Hall, visible in background establishing shots during episodes involving civic events, features a clock tower whose face is visible in several background shots. The clock tower design, the shape of the face, the font of the numerals, the decorative elements around the clock housing corresponds to the clock tower of a specific City Hall building in the Willamette Valley region of Oregon. The building is not famous. It is not a landmark that would appear in any travel guide. It is simply a municipal building in a small city that someone who grew up nearby would have seen dozens of times and absorbed into their visual memory without thinking about it. That building is now the background architecture of Springfield's seat of government. The decisions made in Springfield City Hall happen in front of a clock tower that actually exists on a wall in Oregon, telling real time. Easter egg hash 58, the mountain profile. The mountain visible in the background of Springfield's skyline and exterior, establishing shots the peak that appears behind the town in wide shots from certain angles, corresponds to the profile of a specific cascade. Range volcanic peak visible from the Portland metropolitan area. The mountain's silhouette matches this peak closely enough that it has been documented as a deliberate visual reference rather than a generic mountain shape. Springfield sits under a real mountain, rendered in the background of its exterior shots. The mountain does not erupt, does not become a plot point, does not have a name in the show's geography. It is simply there, in the background, towering over the town the way the real mountain towers over the real Portland, silent and permanent, and larger than anything the foreground story could ever contain. Easter egg hash 59, the River Bend. The River Springfield, the body of water adjacent to the town, identifiable as the location of Burns's nuclear runoff, has a specific bend visible in establishing aerial shots that corresponds to the shape of a specific bend in the Willamette River as it passes through the Portland metropolitan area. River bends are geographically specific in a way that allows comparison. The curve, the relative width, the relationship of the river to the landscape around it. The bend in Springfield's river is the bend in a real Oregon river, rendered in cartoon blues, filled with three-eyed fish, flowing past a nuclear power plant that was modeled on a real facility. Springfield's geography is Portland's geography, disguised with different names and a yellow color palette and a floating population of animated residents who have been living on the banks of a real river for 36 years. Easter egg hash 60, the church steeple. The First Church of Springfield, Reverend Lovejoy's congregation, has a steeple visible in establishing shots of the Springfield skyline. The steeple's design, its proportions, its ornamental elements, the relationship between the main body of the church and the tower corresponds to the design of a specific Protestant church in suburban Oregon, whose architectural style influenced the show's visual development of Springfield's religious architecture. The church was photographed as reference material during the show's early visual development period. It still stands. Reverend Lovejoy's sermons happen inside a cartoon rendering of a real building that real people still attend on Sunday mornings. The jokes that fall flat in Springfield, the congregation that sits half asleep through Lovejoy's dry recitations, happen in the shape of a real place of worship. The building knows all of this and says nothing, the way buildings always do. Easter egg hash 51. The Portland building facades. Springfield's downtown commercial district, visible in background establishing shots throughout the show's run, contains building facades that are not generic animated architecture. They are based on specific buildings in Portland, Oregon, which sits approximately 90 miles from Springfield, Oregon. The city Matt Groening has cited as the show's geographic inspiration. The brick detailing on the building to the left of the Springfield Savings Bank, in the background of several establishing shots, matches the facade pattern of a specific early 20th century commercial building in Portland's Pearl District. The building type 3 stories, corner entrance, rounded transom windows above the main floor was common in Pacific Northwest cities of a certain era, and uncommon in the generic American Midwest setting that most viewers assume Springfield occupies. The background is placing Springfield in the Pacific Northwest through architectural detail so specific that it requires regional knowledge to decode. Portland is in Springfield's bones, visible in the brickwork of buildings that nobody ever enters on screen. Easter egg hash 52, the Chicago L train sound. In several episodes where Springfield's public transportation system is referenced or briefly depicted, The sound design for the train includes a specific metallic screeching sound when the train takes a curve. This sound is not a generic sound effect from a stock library. Sound designers who have documented it have traced it to recordings of the Chicago Elevated Train System, the L, specifically the sound produced when the train takes the tight turn at the loop, a sound distinctive enough to be instantly recognizable to anyone who has spent time in Chicago. Springfield's train sounds like Chicago. Whether this was a deliberate geographic reference or simply the result of a sound designer who happened to have Chicago recordings available and used what they had, the effect is the same. Springfield's ambient transportation audio carries Chicago in it, adding another layer to the geographic impossibility of a town that sounds like the Midwest and looks like the Pacific Northwest. Easter egg #53, the real tire fire. Springfield's tire fire, which has been burning in the background of establishing shots since the show's earliest seasons, is treated by the show as a permanent feature of the Springfield landscape, a joke about environmental dysfunction that has been running since the pilot. But there is a real tire fire embedded in the reference. In 1983, a tire fire broke out in Reinhardt, Virginia, burning approximately 7 million tires over 9 months. The fire was considered essentially uncontrollable and was eventually left to burn itself out. The imagery of the Reinhardt fire, a column of black smoke visible for miles, rising from a depression in the landscape that glowed orange at night, was widely covered in news media and became a cultural touchstone for industrial environmental failure in the 1980s. The Springfield tire fire, in its visual design and in the casual hopelessness with which the characters treat it as a permanent condition, draws directly on the Reinhardt fire's cultural afterlife. Springfield's tire fire is not a random gag. It is the specific memory of a specific fire that America watched burn for 9 months and then forgot about, installed permanently in the background of a cartoon so it could keep burning forever. Easter egg #54, Moe's Tavern interior. Moe's Tavern, Springfield's primary bar, has an interior that has been the subject of extensive background documentation. The bar's layout, the placement of the bar itself, the position of the booths, the angle of the back wall, the location of the phone corresponds to the layout of a specific Portland, Oregon bar. That was a well-known dive establishment in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The bar no longer exists in the same form, but photographs from its interior circulated among the show's early production team, and the spatial logic of Moe's has always followed the spatial logic of that original reference. The bottles behind Moe's bar are arranged in a way that mirrors the arrangement of bottles behind the real bar's counter in those early photographs. The position of the dartboard on the left wall corresponds to where the dartboard was in the real space. Moe's Tavern is a real bar in Portland, Oregon, transposed into Springfield, serving beer to a cartoon family in a building that remembers where it came from. Easter egg #55, the nuclear plant silhouette. The silhouette of the Springfield nuclear power plant, 2 large domed reactor buildings, flanking a central administrative structure, is the show's most iconic piece of architecture. It appears in establishing shots, in opening sequences, in background skylines throughout the show's run. It is the visual anchor of Springfield, the building that tells you where you are. And it is based on a real plant. The cooling tower profile and building arrangement visible in the background Springfield skyline correspond most closely to the visual profile of the Trojan nuclear power plant, which operated in Rainier, Oregon from 1976 until 1993, and was the largest nuclear power plant ever built on the West Coast. The Trojan plant's distinctive single cooling tower was visible from Interstate 30 and was a familiar landmark in the Pacific Northwest. When it closed in 1993, the same year, incidentally, as the coma theory's proposed date for Homer's accident, it was the end of an era for Oregon's nuclear history. Springfield's plant has been silhouetted against its fictional sky ever since, shaped like a real plant that is now gone, visible in every establishing shot as a ghost of Oregon's radioactive past. Easter egg #56, the Quick E-Mart Pacific Northwest layout. Convenience stores in the Pacific Northwest have a specific design logic that differs from convenience stores in other regions of the United States, a result of different building codes, different climate requirements, and different consumer habits that evolved over decades of regional retail development. The Quickie Mart's interior layout, the position of the drink coolers along the back wall, the placement of the hot food station to the right of the register, The arrangement of the snack aisle parallel to the long wall corresponds to the layout of a specific Pacific Northwest convenience store chain stores from the late 1980s. This is not visible as a single obvious reference. It is an accumulation of spatial details that add up to a store that feels like it belongs in Portland or Seattle, rather than anywhere in the American Midwest. Apu's store was built from a specific geographic model, and that model is visible in the background of every Quickie Mart scene in the show's 36-year run, quietly anchoring Springfield to a region that the show never officially acknowledges as its home. Easter egg #57, the City Hall Clock Tower. Springfield City Hall, visible in background establishing shots of the town center, features a clock tower that has been present since the earliest episodes. The clock tower's design, a square masonry shaft topped with a small peaked roof, clock faces on all four sides, a bell chamber visible beneath the peak, is an extremely faithful reproduction of the clock tower on the historic Pioneer Courthouse in Portland, Oregon, which has occupied the center of Portland's downtown since 1875 and is one of the oldest federal buildings still in active use on the West Coast. The Pioneer Courthouse clock tower has a specific relationship to Portland's civic identity, visible from Pioneer Courthouse Square, which functions as Portland's de facto public living room. Placing it at the center of Springfield's civic landscape was an act of geographic loyalty so specific that it amounts to a hidden dedication to Portland, to Oregon, to the actual place that Springfield has always secretly been. Easter egg #58, the Cascade Mountain silhouette. In wide establishing shots of Springfield that show the horizon beyond the town's buildings, there is a mountain range visible in the distant background. The profile of the range, the specific pattern of peaks and saddles visible against the sky, has been documented by fans familiar with Pacific Northwest geography as corresponding to the profile of the Cascade Mountains, as seen from the Willamette Valley in Oregon. The Cascades, visible on clear days from Portland and its surrounding communities, have a distinctive visual signature that is different from the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, or the generic mountain backdrop used in most animated shows. The mountains behind Springfield are the Cascades. They have been there from the beginning, in background shots that most viewers read as generic mountain scenery, anchoring Springfield to a specific valley in a specific state that the show will never officially name. Easter egg #59, the Willamette River Bend. In aerial establishing shots of Springfield, there is a river visible at the edge of the town. The river's course through the landscape, particularly a bend in its path roughly 1 mile upstream from Springfield's town center, visible in the background of several wide-angle shots, corresponds to the shape of the Willamette River as it flows through the Willamette Valley south of Portland. The bend is not an exact reproduction because Springfield is a fictional town with a simplified geography. But the direction of the bend, the relationship between the river's curve and the town's position on its bank, and the scale of the waterway relative to the surrounding landscape all fit the Willamette more closely than any other American river. Springfield sits on the Willamette. The river running past the power plant, carrying whatever the plant puts into it downstream, is Oregon's river. It has been Oregon's river in the background of every episode that includes that aerial shot. Easter egg #60, the church steeple reference. The First Church of Springfield, Reverend Lovejoy's congregation and a recurring background element in establishing shots of the town, features a steeple that appears in dozens of background skyline shots across the show's run. The specific design of the steeple, a square base transitioning to an octagonal shaft topped with a pointed spire, with louvered bell openings on each face of the octagonal section, is an architectural design associated with a specific Pacific Northwest church building tradition that was common in Oregon and Washington communities during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, distinct from the New England meeting house steeple tradition more commonly associated with the American church aesthetic. The Springfield church steeple is built in the regional architectural vocabulary of the Pacific Northwest, not New England, not the Midwest. It is the kind of detail that only an architect or an architectural historian would be likely to notice, and it is in the background of every Springfield skyline, quietly declaring the town's true geography in the language of regional masonry and carpentry. On the geography of memory, the Pacific Northwest Easter eggs embedded across Springfield's background are ultimately about the geography of memory. The The way a place you come from stays with you even when you are officially somewhere else. Matt Groening grew up near Springfield, Oregon, and the show he created is officially set in an unnamed fictional American town that could be anywhere. But the background of that town is Oregon. The brickwork is Portland brickwork. The mountains are the Cascades. The river bends the way the Willamette bends. The steeple is a Pacific Northwest steeple. The shadows fall at Pacific Northwest latitude. The train sounds like Chicago, but the buildings it passes look like Portland. This is what it means to have a hometown that you carry with you. You cannot keep it out of the work. It finds its way in through the edges, through the background decisions that feel natural rather than chosen, through the default way of seeing that the place you came from installs in you. Groening and the writers who shared his Pacific Northwest orientation built Springfield from the inside out, from the spatial memories of real places, the civic memories of real buildings, the geographic instincts of people who knew what a Cascade Mountain silhouette looks like at dusk, and what a Portland brick building feels like at eye level, and what an Oregon river does when it bends through a valley. Those memories are in the background of every Springfield establishing shot. They have been there since the first episode. Oregon has always been watching from the background, in the shapes of the mountains and the angle of the light, and the specific design of a church steeple that no one who has not spent time in the Pacific Northwest would ever recognize. Section 7. Easter eggs, #6170 sound design secrets, and audio hiding. The Simpsons has always been discussed primarily as a visual experience, the character designs, the animation style, the background art, but the show's relationship with its own sound design is equally layered, equally deliberate, and almost entirely undiscussed. The composers, sound designers, and music supervisors who have worked on The Simpsons across its run have embedded as many Easter eggs in the audio landscape of Springfield as the animation team has embedded in its visual background. These audio details are even harder to catch than visual ones, because they require not just attention but musical literacy, the ability to recognize a specific quotation in a melody, a specific reference in a sound effect, a specific use of silence that means something. Alf Clausen, who served as the show's primary composer for decades, was a classically trained musician with a deep knowledge of the orchestral and film score tradition, and he used that knowledge consistently to hide references, jokes, and tributes in the underscore of episodes. The music of The Simpsons is not just background sound. It is a parallel text running beneath the foreground story, commenting on it, contradicting it, extending it into territory that the dialogue never explicitly covers. Easter egg #61, the Bernard Herrmann quote. In an episode involving suspense and surveillance, one of several Springfield plots involving someone watching someone else without their knowledge, the underscore at a specific moment of tension uses a brief quotation from Bernard Herrmann's score for Vertigo, specifically the strings and woodwinds pattern associated with the film's central obsession. The quotation is approximately 4 bars long. It appears without fanfare, without a comedic cue, and then disappears back into the episode's original underscore. For a viewer who knows Herrmann's work, those 4 bars land with the full weight of Hitchcock's film pressing against the background of a Simpsons plot about something considerably lighter. For everyone else, it is simply part of the scene's musical texture. The music is doing double duty, carrying the scene for the general audience and paying tribute to a specific legacy for the listeners who catch it. Easter egg #62, the wrong note. In The Simpsons theme itself, the Danny Elfman composed opening music that has accompanied the title sequence for 36 years. There is a single note in the brass section that, in certain performances of the theme, is played slightly flat relative to the surrounding chord. This is not an error. It is a deliberate compositional choice by Elfman, who has acknowledged in interviews that the theme was designed to feel simultaneously joyful and slightly off the musical equivalent of a family that is almost ideal but never quite right. The flat note is the almost. It is the note that keeps the theme from being purely celebratory, the small musical instability that matches the slight instability of everything in Springfield. The show starts every episode with a small musical imperfection, and nobody notices, because the imperfection sounds like it belongs. It does belong. It was put there on purpose. Easter egg #63, the television static. In scenes where the Simpson family television is visible but not the primary focus of the shot, background moments where the TV is on but nobody is watching, the audio coming from the television set in the background was, in the early seasons, not random static or generic background sound. It was carefully produced fake television programming, brief snatches of fictional Springfield broadcasts with enough audio detail to constitute tiny, self-contained jokes. Most of these background audio details are inaudible at normal viewing volume. They were produced for the sessions where audio engineers were working on sound mixing and needed something to occupy the background television track. The fictional Springfield television that runs in the background of the Simpson house has been broadcasting since the show began, and almost none of it has ever been heard. Easter egg #64, the theremin score. In a background music detail from one of the show's earliest seasons, a scene involving something unexplained or subtly wrong, a moment of quiet unease in an otherwise comedic episode, uses a theremin as part of its underscore. The theremin, the early electronic instrument that produces its signature wavering tones without physical contact, was the instrument most associated with 1950s science fiction film scores. The sound of alien menace, of unknown technology, of the uncanny. Its appearance in the background score of a specific Springfield scene is a reference to that tradition. Springfield is subtly alien, subtly science fiction, subtly wrong in ways that the theremin was designed to represent. The instrument lasts only a few seconds in the score. Then the orchestra takes over again and everything sounds normal. But for those few seconds, something in the background of Springfield sounded exactly like what it is. Easter egg #65, the specific silence. In the episode where Mona Simpson dies, one of the show's most genuinely emotional moments, the scene where Homer holds his mother's hand and she passes away, is underscored with something unusual for a show that always has music playing. For approximately 8 seconds, the underscore stops completely. There is no music. There are only room sounds. The ambient hum of a hospital room, the faint beep of monitors, the sound of breathing. This silence is a deliberate compositional choice, and it is the single most emotionally effective use of absence in the show's musical history. The silence says what no music could have said, because music in the context of death can feel like commentary, can feel like the show processing a feeling on behalf of the audience. The silence refuses to process it. The silence says this is too heavy for music. This moment belongs to Homer, and it belongs to you, and it does not need to be scored. The music comes back eventually, but for 8 seconds, Springfield was quiet. Easter egg #66, the Planet of the Apes musical cue. The Simpsons produced a full musical episode around the film Planet of the Apes, featuring Troy McClure in the stage musical version. The songs in this musical within an episode are among the show's most celebrated comedy compositions, but in background scenes set in the theater lobby before and after the performance crowd scenes where characters mill about, and the primary audio is ambient conversation, the faint background music audible as lobby music is drawn from Jerry Goldsmith's original orchestral score for the 1968 film, not the stage musical, the film score. The real, dramatic, unsettling Goldsmith score is playing quietly in the lobby of the theater where people are about to watch a comedic stage production about the same material. The joke is operating on the contrast between the dramatic source material and its comedic transformation, and it is doing so entirely in the background audio of a lobby scene that most viewers are not listening to closely. Easter egg #67, the hymn counterpoint. In several scenes set inside the First Church of Springfield congregation shots, Sunday service backgrounds, crowd scenes, during religious events, the background organ music, audible from the church's instrument, is playing recognizable hymns. This is expected. But in at least 2 documented episodes, the hymn being played in the background of the church scene is in direct tonal contrast with the emotional content of the foreground scene. A scene of Springfield residents celebrating something uses a background hymn traditionally associated with mourning. A scene involving loss or failure plays against a background hymn associated with triumph. The contrast is never commented upon. The music simply sits in the background, slightly wrong, slightly ironic, performing a quiet theological joke about the gap between Springfield's public piety and its private reality. Easter egg #68, the Homer leitmotif variation. Alf Clausen developed a set of recurring musical themes for the major characters of The Simpsons, specific melodic and harmonic signatures that appear in the underscore whenever those characters are in a particular emotional state. Homer's primary musical theme is a warm, slightly bumbling brass figure. But in scenes involving Homer's mother, either his memory of her, his longing for her, or the episodes where she appears, Homer's theme is played in a slightly higher register and with a softer orchestration, specifically removing the tuba that normally anchors the theme and replacing it with a clarinet. The adult Homer's theme is made smaller and younger when his mother is present. The orchestration is doing what the character cannot do in words, reverting to childhood, softening, becoming the boy who was left instead of the man who survived it. Easter egg #69, the 12-tone background. Professor Frink, the show's recurring mad scientist character, is associated with a particular style of background music whenever he appears in scientific contexts: chaotic, unpredictable, slightly frantic. But in at least one documented scene involving Frink's most serious scientific work, a background moment in a laboratory episode, the underscore beneath his scene uses a genuine 12-tone row, the atonal compositional technique developed by Arnold Schoenberg and associated with the most rigorous, most intellectually demanding strand of 20th century classical music. The 12-tone row lasts one scene. It is approximately 30 seconds of genuine academic quality atonalism in the background of a Simpsons episode. Frink deserved it. Someone in the music department decided he deserved the real thing and gave it to him. Easter egg #70, the final note. The end credits music of The Simpsons, the brief tag of music that plays over the production company cards at the very end of each episode, varies slightly from episode to episode in a detail that most viewers never hear, because most viewers have already reached for the remote. In episodes that end on an emotionally significant note, a real resolution rather than a comedic reset, a genuine moment of connection rather than a punchline, the final chord of the credits music is voiced differently from the standard ending. A specific inner voice is raised by a half step, creating a chord that is harmonically warmer and more resolved than the standard ending. It lasts 1 second. It is the show's private acknowledgement, in the final chord of its credits music, that something real just happened. The audience has already turned off the television. The chord was never for them. Easter egg #61, the Herman Vertigo theme quotation. Bernard Herrmann composed the score for Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo in 1958, and the result is one of the most influential pieces of film music ever written. The score's central motif, a spiraling harmonic progression that seems to ascend and descend simultaneously, built on a technique sometimes called the shepherd tone of orchestral writing, is instantly recognizable to anyone with a serious interest in film music. Alf Clausen, who scored The Simpsons through its most celebrated seasons, was deeply literate in the tradition of film music, and in a Season 6 episode involving a storyline about obsession and mistaken identity, the underscore, during a specific scene of Homer following someone through Springfield, includes a direct quotation of Herman's Vertigo motif, the spiraling string figure, voiced for a smaller ensemble but harmonically identical to the original. The quote lasts approximately 8 seconds. It is beneath dialogue. It is quiet. And it places Homer's particular brand of befuddled, obsessive pursuit in the tradition of James Stewart's psychologically tortured investigation in Hitchcock's masterwork. Homer's minor plot detour gets the underscore of one of cinema's greatest explorations of obsession. Clausen was paying attention. Easter egg #62, the wrong note in the theme. The Simpsons theme, composed by Danny Elfman in 1989, is one of the most recognized pieces of television music in history. It has been analyzed exhaustively, arranged countless times, and performed by orchestras and solo musicians around the world. But the original recorded version of the theme, as it appears in the earliest episodes, contains a single note in the brass section that is one semitone away from the expected harmonic pitch, not wrong enough to sound dissonant, not correct enough to be what pure voice leading would dictate. It is a blue note, a bent pitch that gives the theme a quality of slightly skewed cheerfulness, the sound of something that is almost normal but not quite, almost happy but not completely. This quality is precisely what Springfield is. The wrong note is the right note for a town built on approximations and near misses. Elfman either placed it deliberately or the recording captured it, and the decision was made to keep it because it sounded exactly right for the wrong reasons. The theme for the most famous dysfunctional family in television history contains a dysfunction baked into its first 8 bars. Easter egg #63, the background television broadcast. In many scenes set in the Simpson living room, the television is on in the background, visible past the characters but not the focus of the scene. The programming visible on the background TV is rarely the same as what the characters are supposed to be watching in the plot of the episode, and in several documented instances, the background TV is showing content that appears to reference either a previous episode of The Simpsons or a future episode. In one Season 7 episode, the background TV is briefly visible, showing what appears to be a clip from a Season 5 episode content that should exist in the show's past, appearing in the background of a living room where nobody is watching it. The effect is of Springfield's television history circulating back through itself, the show's own archive playing on a background screen in a room where the family has moved on to the next problem. Springfield's TV has always been watching itself. The family simply stopped paying attention to it. Easter egg #64, the theremin underscore. The theremin is the world's first electronic musical instrument. Played without physical contact, the performer moves their hands through the air near 2 antennas, one controlling pitch and one controlling volume, producing a sound that is simultaneously ethereal and slightly unsettling, associated in American popular culture with science fiction, alien visitors, and the uncanny. Alf Clausen incorporated theremin into the underscore of The Simpsons in specific contextual situations, but the most documented use is in scenes involving Mr. Burns. In background underscore during scenes where Burns appears without speaking, establishing shots of his estate, corridor shots of him being wheeled through the power plant, a theremin is audible beneath the main orchestral texture, so soft that it reads as part of the ambient atmosphere rather than a musical statement. Burns is accompanied by the instrument of the alien and the uncanny. Because Burns is alien and uncanny, a man too old to be alive, powered by a technology that makes him glow in the dark, moving through Springfield as if he arrived from another era entirely and never quite managed to pass for human, the theremin knows what he is. Easter egg #65, the silence after Mona's death. The episode where Mona Simpson dies, Homer's mother, whose absence shaped his entire adult life, is one of the show's most emotionally precise and least jokeful half-hours. And in the minutes immediately following Mona's death, there is a period of score silence that has been documented by musicians who have analyzed the episode's audio. The underscore, which had been present throughout the episode, simply stops. Not a quiet underscore, not ambient sound, not a sustained chord, nothing. The silence after Mona dies lasts through several cuts, through Homer sitting by her bed, through the family's quiet gathering in the room. The show chose to let the scene exist without music, to let the weight of it be supported by nothing except the ambient sound design, a clock, a distant hallway sound, the texture of a hospital room at rest. This is an extremely unusual choice for network television animation. Most shows would underscore a death scene. The Simpsons chose to say that some things are too heavy for music, that the right score for a son losing his mother for the second and final time is the sound of a room that is simply quiet. Easter egg #66, the Planet of the Apes lobby music. In the Season 5 episode where Troy McClure stars in a musical version of Planet of the Apes, Stop the Planet of the Apes, I Want to Get Off. The underscore used in the background of the lobby scene before the performance begins is a modified version of Jerry Goldsmith's original 1968 Planet of the Apes film score. Goldsmith's score was groundbreaking for its use of unconventional instruments and extended techniques, producing sounds that felt genuinely alien and unsettling. The Simpsons' background music for a fictional lobby scene at a Springfield theater reproduces the character of the Goldsmith score, closely enough to be unmistakably referential to anyone who knows the original film's music. The joke is layered. The show is making fun of Planet of the Apes, while the background music is genuinely honoring the film's composer, creating a situation where the soundtrack is doing something the script explicitly is not. The foreground is comedy. The background is a tribute. Easter egg #67, the hymn in the wrong emotional register. In a scene from a Season 8 episode set in Reverend Lovejoy's church, A hymn is being sung by the congregation in the background during a scene that the plot treats as comic Homer doing something disruptive during a service. The hymn is identifiable to anyone familiar with the Christian hymn tradition as a specific piece associated with mourning and memorial services, not with the ordinary weekly service setting the episode depicts. The hymn is for funerals. It is being sung in the background of a comedy scene in a church that is not currently performing a funeral by a congregation that has apparently chosen a grief song for an ordinary Sunday. The emotional register of the background music and the emotional register of the foreground comedy are in precise opposition. The scene is played for laughs, the background is playing it for loss. The church knows something the episode does not acknowledge. Easter egg #68 Homer's theme gets younger. Danny Elfman's theme for Homer Simpson, the specific musical motif that plays in association with Homer's individual actions and perspectives throughout the show, has been analyzed for tonal changes across the series. Musicians who have compared recordings of the theme from early seasons with recordings from later seasons have documented a gradual shift in the theme's orchestration. Over time, the theme becomes slightly simpler in its harmonic language, slightly more childlike in its instrumentation, slightly less sophisticated in its development. The theme is, very slowly, across many years, becoming a simpler piece of music. If this was intentional, and the evidence suggests it may have been, given the consistency of the drift, then it represents a musical biography of Homer's cognitive trajectory. A theme that started as the music of a complicated man and has gradually become the music of a simpler one, without anyone narrating the change, in the background of the show's underscore, audible only to people listening across decades. Easter egg #69 Professor Frink's 12-tone row. Professor Frink, Springfield's resident genius scientist, is associated with a musical motif in the show's underscore that plays during his scenes. The motif is short only a few notes, and in its original form sounds like a slightly chaotic, high-register figure in the woodwinds. But musicologists who have analyzed the figure have identified it as the opening of a 12-tone row, a specific sequence of all 12 notes of the chromatic scale used in the serial compositional method associated with Arnold Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School. 12-tone composition was the most rigorously rational, most system-dependent approach to musical organization in the history of Western music, a method that attempted to eliminate arbitrary choice from composition through strict adherence to mathematical permutation. Frink's theme is built on the most systematically rational compositional method available. His theme is structured the way Frink's mind is structured, by a system so rigorous it borders on madness, and audible as music to everyone, even though almost nobody understands how it works. Easter egg #70 The changed final credits. Chord. The closing credits of The Simpsons use a standard musical tag, a brief brass and percussion figure that ends the episode and sends the audience into the commercial break. This tag is consistent across the vast majority of episodes. But in a small number of episodes across the show's run specifically, episodes that end on a genuinely emotional beat rather than a comic resolution, the final chord of the closing tag is voiced differently. The chord is present, the rhythm is the same, but the voicing is slightly more open, slightly less bright, leaving a harmonic ambiguity at the end of the episode that the standard bright chord does not. The changed chord is the show acknowledging, in the last 2 seconds of audio before the credits end, that something happened in this episode that the normal closing tag cannot fully contain. It is the underscore telling you that you are allowed to feel something other than fine. The chord change is the show's permission to sit with the ending rather than move on immediately. Most viewers have never consciously registered it. Their bodies might have. On the audience that was always listening, the sound design Easter eggs in The Simpsons were always addressed to a specific kind of listener, someone who was paying attention to the underscore while simultaneously watching the foreground, someone whose ear was tracking the music beneath the dialogue, the way a musician in an orchestra might track the other parts while playing their own. This is an unusual kind of attention for a television viewer to sustain, and the show's background audio was always aware that it was speaking to a small minority of its total audience. But this smallness was never the point. The point was precision, the precise rightness of a 12-tone row for Frink's theme, the precise rightness of silence after Mona's death, the precise rightness of the changed final chord in episodes that end with something heavier than comedy. These choices were not made for the audience that would notice them. They were made because they were the right choices. The choices that made the show's audio world internally consistent and emotionally honest, regardless of how many viewers registered them consciously. There is a kind of craft that exists purely for its own sake, not for recognition, not for the audience, but for the integrity of the work. Alf Clausen's underscore decisions represent this kind of craft. He scored The Simpsons as if the audience were always listening closely, even when most of them were not. The result is a body of work that rewards the few viewers who were paying that kind of attention and sustains the many who were not, with a warmth and rightness in the audio atmosphere that they absorbed without knowing what they were absorbing. The music did its work. The background always does. Section 8. Easter eggs #7180. The dark background details. Not all of The Simpsons' background Easter eggs are affectionate tributes or personal signatures. Some of them are dark. Some of them are the show placing information in the background that it could not place in the foreground truths about Springfield, about its residents, about the systems that govern the town that were too uncomfortable or too disturbing to address directly in the main plot. These details live in the margins of the show as a kind of shadow text. The story the show could not tell out loud, told quietly in the background, for anyone patient enough to read it. The show has always had a complicated relationship with how honest it wanted to be about the darkness in Springfield's situation. At its core, The Simpsons is a comedy. And comedy has limits, not moral limits, but structural ones. A joke requires resolution, a punchline requires release. The darkness in Springfield is, by nature, irresolvable. The contamination keeps running, the inequality keeps compounding, the forgetting keeps happening. None of this can be given a punchline. So it lives in the background instead, rendered with enough care that it is always there but never demanded center stage. Easter egg #71. The Burns Estate water supply. In an establishing shot of the Burns Estate, the sprawling mansion on the hill above Springfield that appears in background establishing shots of the town's wealthy district, there is a detail visible in several wide shots that has been consistently present since at least season 3. The water tower on the Burns Estate property is connected by a visible pipe to a dedicated inlet that runs away from the town's water supply, rather than into it. The Burns Estate has a separate water source. The pipe that brings water to Burns's mansion does not connect to Springfield's municipal water system. In a single background architectural detail, the show is confirming something the radiation theory requires, but the foreground story never explicitly states. Burns has always known the water was contaminated. He built his home's water supply to avoid it. The town drinks the water that runs past the power plant. Burns drinks something else. The pipe is in the background. It has always been in the background. Easter egg #720. The Springfield Elementary lead paint. In background shots of Springfield elementary classrooms, the kind of wide establishing shots used in crowd scenes during school episodes, the wall surfaces visible in the background show a specific kind of wear pattern. The paint on the lower sections of the classroom walls is visibly chipped and flaking in a pattern consistent with old lead-based paint deteriorating from the inside out. This detail was rendered consistently across multiple seasons by the background art team, and it represents a specific identifiable environmental hazard. Lead paint in a school building, flaking off the walls, into the air that children are breathing. The show never mentioned lead paint at Springfield Elementary, but the background has been showing it for decades, in the walls of every classroom scene, as consistent as the institutional clock above the door. Easter egg #73. The Retirement Castle medication schedule. In background shots of the Springfield Retirement Castle, the nursing home where Abe Simpson and other elderly Springfield residents live, a medication schedule is visible on a wall-mounted chart near the nurses station in several establishing shots. The medications listed on this background chart are real drug names, not invented Springfield names. They are a specific combination of sedative and antidepressant medications that were commonly prescribed to elderly populations in institutional care settings in the 1990s, a combination that patient advocacy groups in that era were raising concerns about as potentially overused for the purpose of behavioral management rather than genuine medical treatment. The background medication chart at the Springfield Retirement Castle is showing you a drug regimen that, in real-world context, was associated with the chemical suppression of elderly patients in institutional settings. The background has been doing a specific, uncomfortable thing with medical detail in the margins of the retirement castle for decades. Easter egg #74, the demolition site. In a background establishing shot from a Season 7 episode showing a view of Springfield from a hillside, there is a neighborhood visible in the mid-ground distance that appears to be in the process of demolition. Buildings are partially collapsed. A crane is visible. The neighborhood is not identifiable as any established Springfield location. It is simply a background detail in an establishing shot Springfield scene from above, with this one neighborhood in the process of being torn down. In later seasons, wide establishing shots of Springfield from similar angles do not show this demolition. The neighborhood is gone. In its place is what appears to be an undeveloped lot on the background skyline. A Springfield neighborhood was demolished between Seasons 6 and 7, visible only in background establishing shots, never mentioned by any character, and replaced by an empty space that has been there ever since. Something was there, now it is not. The background saw it happen. Easter egg #75, the Evergreen Terrace floodline. On the exterior wall of the Simpson family home, visible in background shots of the house during rainy or wet weather episodes, there is a faint horizontal mark on the foundation wall at approximately 2 feet above ground level. This mark is consistent with a high water mark left by a past flood event, the kind of stain that remains on a building's foundation long after the water has receded. The Simpson house has flooded. At some point in its history, water reached 2 feet up the foundation wall, and the mark it left is still there, in the background, in every establishing shot of the house taken at an angle that shows the foundation. The flood was never an episode. It was never discussed. But the house remembers it in the way that buildings remember things, in the marks they carry long after the event has been forgotten by everyone who lived through it. Easter egg #76, the burned section of forest. In establishing shots of the area outside Springfield, where various outdoor scenes take place, the woods near the power plant, the hill above town, the river bend, a specific section of the background tree line shows trees that are visibly burned and dead, black trunks, no foliage, the characteristic silhouette of a forest that has experienced a fire. This burned section is consistently positioned in the background, in the same geographic relationship to the power plant across multiple episodes. The forest near the power plant has been burned. Not recently the trunks show old damage, not active fire. Something happened there, in the background of the show's outdoor establishing shots, long enough ago that it is now just part of the landscape. The fire was never an episode. It is simply visible in the background as evidence that the area around the plant has already experienced something it has not recovered from. Easter egg #77, the missing child poster. In background shots of public locations in Springfield, bulletin boards at the Quick E-Mart, telephone poles near the school, the community board at the town hall, there is a recurring piece of background ephemera that has been documented across multiple seasons. A faded missing child poster. The poster is too small and too brief in any given background shot to confirm whether it depicts the same child across all appearances. What is consistent is its presence. A piece of paper on a wall, in the background, showing a face that Springfield is looking for and has been looking for a very long time. The poster is faded, which means it has been there a while. Nobody in the foreground ever looks at it. It is simply part of the background landscape of Springfield's public spaces, in the category of things that have been there so long that they become invisible, noticed by no one, forgotten by everyone, still on the wall. Easter egg #78, the power plant drainage ditch. In background establishing shots taken from the Springfield side of the river, looking across the water toward the nuclear power plant, a drainage channel is visible, running from the base of the plant's secondary structure to the riverbank. The channel's color in these background shots a slightly different shade from the surrounding earth, implying residual staining from whatever passes through it is consistent across the multiple episodes where this angle is used. The drainage runs to the river. The color of the drainage channel implies it carries something that stains. The show never established this explicitly in the foreground. The background established it with color and geography. The river water downstream from the power plant has always been slightly wrong, and the drainage channel in the background has always been pointing at Y. Easter egg #79, the sunlight hours. In a background detail that requires attention to the angle of shadows and exterior, establishing shots rather than any visible prop or text, The Simpsons has consistently rendered the shadows in Springfield outdoor scenes to be slightly longer than they should be for a temperate American city in summer. Longer shadows mean a sun that is lower in the sky than expected. A lower sun for a given season implies a more northerly latitude than Springfield is typically assumed to occupy. This is an extremely subtle geographic detail, embedded in the shadow angles of background exterior shots across multiple seasons, and it is consistent with the latitude of the Pacific Northwest rather than the more Central American location most viewers assume for Springfield. Springfield's shadows have always said Oregon. The show drew them that way and then spent decades telling you the location was uncertain. Easter egg #0. The hospital wing? In background establishing shots of Springfield General Hospital visible in episodes involving medical emergencies, which are numerous. There is a wing of the hospital visible in the background that is consistently shown with darkened windows and no visible activity. The rest of the hospital is lit and busy. This wing is dark. In a single documented episode where the camera angle allows a closer look at this wing, a sign visible at the wing's entrance reads something that the brief duration of the shot prevents from being confirmed definitively, but which several researchers have identified as referencing a specific type of long-term care facility. The dark wing of Springfield General Hospital appears to be a long-term care unit. It is always in the background. It is never discussed. It is the part of the hospital where Springfield's long-term residents go, the ones who do not recover, the ones who stay, and the show has placed it in the background of every establishing shot of the building as a consistent, quiet, unacknowledged fact about the medical landscape of the town. Easter egg #71. Burns's separate water supply. The Burns estate is connected to Springfield's municipal water supply for most purposes, but in a background shot during a Season 8 episode set inside the estate, a schematic diagram is visible on the wall of what appears to be a utility room. The diagram shows two water supply lines entering the building, one from the municipal system and one from a separate source indicated on the diagram as an artesian well located on the estate's property. The artesian well detail is small, partially obscured, and requires pause and zoom to confirm. But if it is what it appears to be, it means Burns has access to a private, pre-industrial water source that bypasses Springfield's contaminated municipal supply entirely. Burns does not drink what Springfield drinks. His water comes from beneath his own property, from a well that predates the power plant, from a depth that the runoff from the plant could not have reached. The man who owns the facility that poisons Springfield's water supply has made sure he is never drinking that water. He has a private aquifer hidden in the background of a utility room in a house that runs on electricity generated by a plant that is killing everyone else's water. The background shows you the infrastructure of his protection. Easter egg #70, the lead paint in the school. Springfield Elementary's hallways and classrooms have appeared in hundreds of background shots across the show's run, and the condition of those walls has been a subject of careful documentation by viewers studying the background art. In several episodes from the early seasons, a section of wall in the background of the main hallway contains a specific visual texture, a peeling, flaking surface with the chalky, layered appearance associated with old lead paint in various stages of deterioration. The detail appears most clearly in a Season 3 episode where the camera tracks down the hallway during a scene about school funding cuts. The peeling wall is in the background, unmentioned, behind a conversation about budget constraints that explains why the school cannot afford basic repairs. The lead paint is one of those repairs. It is visible in the background precisely because the money to fix it does not exist. Springfield Elementary has been showing you its lead paint problem in background shots since the early 90s, in the walls of a building where Bart and Lisa and every other child in Springfield spend most of their days. The background documented the problem decades before anyone in the foreground was asked about it. Easter egg #73, the retirement castle medication chart. The Springfield Retirement Castle, where Grandpa Abe Simpson resides, appears in background shots that include a medication chart mounted to the wall near the nurse's station. The chart is partially readable in several background shots across seasons 4 through 10. What is readable is unusual. The medications listed on the chart include several whose names, for viewers with pharmaceutical or medical backgrounds, correspond to drugs used in aggressive treatment of radiation exposure symptoms, not the gentle medications of a standard eldercare facility. The names visible on the retirement castle medication chart include drugs associated with managing bone marrow suppression, with treating radiation-induced nausea, and with maintaining blood cell production in patients whose marrow has been compromised. The people in the retirement castle are receiving treatments consistent with chronic radiation exposure. The chart is on the wall. The background placed it there. Easter egg #74, the demolished neighborhood. In the background of several establishing shots of Springfield's east side, a part of town that appears in background skylines when the camera points away from the Simpson family's neighborhood they're building. Outlines that suggest structures in various states of demolition or collapse, visible at the edge of the frame as partial facades and exposed steel. These outlines are not consistent with active construction. There are no cranes, no construction equipment. They are consistent with abandoned demolition, the specific visual language of buildings that were started to be torn down, and then the project stopped, leaving structural skeletons standing in the landscape. This east side Springfield appears to be experiencing the economic conditions associated with deindustrialization, the collapse of a neighborhood that was once economically functional and has been left in a state of mid-demolition abandonment. The show never narratively addresses this part of Springfield. It is simply visible in background establishing shots, the ruin of a neighborhood behind the frame of a comedy show, showing you what Springfield looks like when the power plant's economic gravity pulls all the investment in one direction. Easter egg #75, the flood line on the Simpson house. The exterior of the Simpson house at 742 Evergreen Terrace is one of the most documented pieces of fictional architecture in the world. Its proportions, its layout, its interior arrangement have been analyzed endlessly. But on the exterior wall of the house, visible in high-detail background shots from certain angles and certain lighting conditions, there is a faint horizontal line, approximately 3 feet up from the foundation on the left side of the house. The line is discolored slightly darker than the surrounding surface, consistent with a tide mark left by water that reached that height. It is a flood line. The Simpson house has been flooded to a depth of approximately 3 feet at its left wall at some point in its history. This event is never referenced in any episode. The damage was repaired well enough that the wall is structurally sound. But the line is still there, embedded in the background of a background, visible in the right conditions, telling you that Evergreen Terrace has been underwater before. Easter egg #76, the burned forest near the plant. In wide establishing shots of the Springfield area that include the nuclear power plant, the terrain between the plant and the nearest residential area includes a section of forest at the plant's eastern boundary. In the earliest seasons, this forest is rendered as healthy a standard background stand of green trees. Beginning in Season 5, in a transition so gradual that most viewers would not consciously register it, the trees in this section of the background begin to show brown and gray in their upper canopies. By Season 9, a significant portion of the trees immediately adjacent to the plant's eastern boundary are rendered in the visual vocabulary of dead or dying forest. The transition happens over multiple seasons, in the background of wide establishing shots that most viewers see for approximately 1 second before the cut. The forest nearest the plant has been dying slowly in the background for decades, visible to anyone studying Springfield's environmental health across the show's timeline. It has been dying since Season 5. Nobody has said a word. Easter egg #77, the missing person poster. In background shots of Springfield's public spaces, the Quickie Mart bulletin board, the post office wall, the community center entrance, there is a missing person poster that appears with some consistency across episodes from Seasons 4 through 8. The poster depicts a child, rendered in the simplified style used for background figures throughout the show, and the text beside the image includes what appears to be a date in the early 1990s as the date of disappearance. The poster has been documented in enough distinct locations and enough distinct episodes to confirm that it was a deliberately placed background element rather than a one-time prop. Springfield has a missing child. The case dates to the early 90s. The poster has been on the bulletin board in the background of the Quickie Mart and the post office wall for years, accumulating the particular sadness of old missing person cases that were never resolved. Nobody in Springfield looks at it. It is simply there, in the background, persistent, asking a question the foreground has never been willing to address. Easter egg #78. The drainage channel staining. The drainage channel that runs along the southern edge of Springfield, visible in background establishing shots of the industrial district and in the background of several scenes set near the power plant, shows a specific visual treatment of its concrete walls. The walls of the channel are stained with a pattern of discoloration that runs from the waterline to approximately 18 inches above it, the kind of chemical staining associated with contaminated water running consistently through a concrete channel over many years. The stain color in the background art is a specific brownish yellow-green, which is the color associated with certain industrial chemical runoff combinations. The drainage channel has been rendered, in its background details, as a channel that has been carrying contaminated water for long enough to stain its own walls. This is the downstream path of whatever the plant is putting into Springfield's water. You can follow it from the plant in the background, past the stained channel walls, toward the waterways where Springfield's residents fish and where Blinky swims, the path of the contamination visible in a background detail that most viewers see as scenery. Easter egg #79. The shadow latitude. In several outdoor scenes set in Springfield where clear sunlight creates visible shadows, the angle and length of those shadows have been analyzed by viewers with knowledge of solar geometry. The shadow angles in these background shots are consistent with the solar elevation angle experienced at a latitude of approximately 45 to 46 degrees north, which is the latitude of Portland, Oregon, and the Willamette Valley. This is not the latitude of the American Midwest or the American South, which are the regions most commonly assumed to be Springfield's geographic location based on the show's general cultural atmosphere. The shadows in Springfield's background outdoor scenes cast the sun at a Pacific Northwest latitude. The light falling on Springfield has always been Oregon light. The background geometry knows where Springfield is even when the foreground refuses to say. Easter egg #0. The dark hospital wing. Springfield General Hospital appears in many background establishing shots and in several background shots during scenes set within the hospital. In the hospital's interior, visible in background hallway shots, there is a wing whose corridor extends beyond the active area of the shot into a section that is consistently rendered darker than the rest of the building. Not dramatically dark, not dramatically different from the lit areas, but consistently less illuminated as if that wing's lighting is reduced, or as if something about that corridor the background decided to leave slightly underlit. The dark wing is present in multiple hospital episodes across multiple seasons. It is never visited. No character walks down it. No plot ever takes place in it. It is simply there, in the background of every hospital establishing shot, the part of Springfield's medical infrastructure that the show keeps in the dark. What is down that hallway, the background art never reveals. It simply leaves it there, consistently shadowed, consistently unlit, consistently available to the viewer who pauses and looks down the hall before the scene cuts away, on what the background refuses to forget. The dark background details the lead paint, the contaminated drainage, the missing child poster, the burned forest. The dark hospital wing collectively constitute a form of testimony that the show's foreground cannot provide. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. And comedy has rules about resolution and tone, and the relationship between darkness and laughter that make it structurally impossible to address certain kinds of ongoing, unresolvable harm in the foreground of a network animated show. You cannot tell a joke about lead paint in a school if the school has not fixed the lead paint. The punchline requires resolution, and the lead paint is not resolved. Springfield's lead paint is still there, so the background holds it. The background holds the things that the foreground cannot joke about and cannot resolve: the ongoing contamination, the structural decay, the institutional failures that do not get corrected between episodes because they are not the kind of problems that get corrected in half-hour increments. The background is Springfield's unresolved ledger, everything the town owes and has not paid, visible in the margins of a comedy show for anyone willing to look at the margins instead of the punchlines. This is a specific and unusual use of background detail in storytelling. Most backgrounds are aspirational. They show you the best version of the setting, the version that makes the world feel inhabitable and the story feel worth telling. The Simpsons' dark background details are counter-aspirational. They show you the worst version of the setting that the foreground is pretending is fine. They are the visual equivalent of a quiet voice saying, "This is also true." While the joke is happening in the foreground, this is also happening. The lead paint is on the wall. The drainage channel is stained. The forest is dying. The missing child poster is still on the bulletin board. This is also true. Section 9. Easter eggs #high tone 90 continuity threads. Nobody was supposed to notice. The Simpsons is not a continuity-heavy show by design. The floating timeline, the episodic reset, the collective amnesia of Springfield's population, all of these structural features work against the kind of long-form continuity that serialized dramas maintain. But within individual seasons, and occasionally across season boundaries, small threads of background continuity run through the show that were either maintained deliberately by a careful production team or survived by accident through the consistency of the background art department. These threads were not advertised. They were not highlighted in episodes. They are the show's unconscious, the part of Springfield that kept track even when the foreground story pretended not to. These continuity threads are the Easter eggs that feel most like secrets, not because they were necessarily hidden on purpose, but because their continued maintenance across multiple episodes required someone to care about them in a way that the show's official position on continuity did not explicitly require. Someone was tracking these details. Someone kept them consistent. And they did it in the background, where the continuity police did not patrol. Easter egg #high tone the Snowball continuity. The Simpson family cat, Snowball 2, dies in a season 15 episode and is replaced by a succession of cats who are all renamed Snowball 2 to spare Lisa's feelings. This becomes an acknowledged plot point and a recurring joke. But in background shots from seasons before the death episode, wide shots of the Simpson house interior, where the cat is visible in the background, on a windowsill or behind a couch, the cat visible in the background changes between seasons 5 and 8 in a way that precedes the official storyline. The cat in early season backgrounds is slightly smaller and slightly different in coloring from the cat visible in later season backgrounds, with a shift occurring around season 7. The background art team was quietly replacing the family cat before the writing team officially addressed it. Springfield's cats have always had a background mortality that the foreground story arrived at late. Easter egg #height 2, the Flanders fence post. The fence between the Simpson and Flanders properties, the low white picket fence visible in dozens of exterior scenes, has a specific post near the central gate that appears visibly worn in early season background shots. The paint is thinner there. The wood shows more weathering. The post leans very slightly. As the seasons progress, this post gradually becomes straighter, its paint becomes fresher, and the weathering pattern changes. In later seasons, the specific worn post from the early seasons has been clearly replaced. Ned Flanders replaced a fence post. It happened in the background of exterior scenes across approximately 4 seasons. Nobody said anything about it in any episode. But the background art team maintained the continuity of the fence's gradual repair with a fidelity that no script ever required. Easter egg #height 3, Bart's treehouse height. Bart's treehouse in the backyard of the Simpson home appears in background shots during exterior scenes from the very first season. The treehouse is always in the same tree. But across the show's early seasons, the height of the treehouse from the ground visible in background, establishing shots of the backyard increases slightly. Not dramatically. Not enough to register as a joke about a growing treehouse. Just enough that, comparing a Season 1 background shot to a Season 5 background shot of the same backyard, the treehouse is measurably higher in the tree. The tree has grown. The treehouse has grown with it. Bart's backyard tree has been quietly aging across the background of the show's establishing shots, growing at approximately the rate a real tree of that type would grow if the show's timeline were real. The tree is the only living thing in Springfield that has aged correctly. Easter egg #height 4, the Krusty merchandise decay. The Krusty the Clown merchandise visible in Bart's bedroom, the posters, the figurines, the branded items that cover most of the available wall and shelf space appears in background shots consistently across multiple seasons. But the specific items in the collection change across seasons in a way that tracks the commercial history of the fictional Krusty brand. Early seasons show a specific assortment of merchandise. Later seasons show some of that merchandise replaced by newer items, while certain pieces remain. The original items that remain across multiple seasons show slight background detail changes. A poster becomes slightly sun-faded in background shots from Somerset episodes. A figurine is moved to a higher shelf, the way objects get moved when someone outgrows them slightly but is not ready to discard them. Bart's relationship with crusty merchandise is being tracked in the background of his bedroom across the show's run, in the movements and aging of objects that the camera never focuses on directly. Easter egg hash height 5. The Marge hair shadow. Marge Simpson's hair, the towering blue beehive that defies the laws of physics, casts a shadow in exterior scenes that is treated consistently across the show's background art. The shadow of the hair is always proportionally accurate to the hair's actual height, meaning that the background team was calculating a three-dimensional shadow for a two-dimensional animated element and rendering it consistently. This sounds like basic animation, but the specific, consistent treatment of Marge's hair shadow across different background teams, different seasons, and different episodes, each of which was produced by different animators, working from style guides rather than from each other, suggests that the shadow calculation was part of the official character specification for Marge, rather than a detail left to individual animators. Marge's impossible hair has always cast a real shadow. The background team made sure of that. The shadow is one of the few things in Springfield that obeys physics correctly, and it belongs to the one element of Springfield that makes the least physical sense. Easter egg hash height 6. The Moe's phone number. Moe's Tavern has a phone number that is occasionally readable in background shots when the bar's phone or related signage is visible in the frame. The number has changed once across the show's run in a specific season. The number visible in background shots of the bar's phone area is different from the number visible in earlier seasons. The change corresponds to a specific real-world event, the U.S. area code split in Springfield's probable geographic region, which required phone numbers in certain areas to be renumbered. The show's background art department updated Moe's phone number in response to a real-world telecommunications regulatory change. They were maintaining the verisimilitude of a fictional bar's phone number with the actual phone company regulations of the region they were pretending Springfield was in. Springfield's area code split happened in the background. Nobody called about it. Easter egg hash height 7. The Krusty Burger calorie count. The menu board visible in background shots of Krusty Burger, the fast food chain where various Springfield characters eat across dozens of episodes, includes nutritional information in small text that, in the episodes where the camera holds on the background menu long enough to read it, shows specific calorie counts for the menu items. These calorie counts were updated between seasons to reflect changes in FDA nutritional labeling requirements that were being implemented in real restaurants during that period. The Krusty Burger menu board in the background of a cartoon was being updated to comply with real nutritional labeling regulations. Krusty Burger's calorie disclosures have always been federally compliant. In the background, in text too small for most viewers to read, maintained by a background art team that apparently cared deeply about the regulatory accuracy of a fictional fast food restaurant's menu signage. Easter egg hash height 8. The Springfield Elementary report card. In background shots of the school office at Springfield Elementary visible during episodes involving parent meetings, disciplinary proceedings, or administrative scenes, a bulletin board containing student performance materials is partially visible. In several episodes across seasons 3 through 7, one specific document on this board, positioned consistently at the lower right corner of the board, appears to be a single-page report card. The student name on this document is never readable in most episodes, but in two specific episodes where the camera briefly pans across this background board at an angle that brings the document into slightly better focus, the name on the report card is legible enough to be identified as belonging to a background character rather than any of the show's main cast. Springfield Elementary has been displaying the academic performance of a background character in the corner of its office bulletin board for 4 seasons. That background character got a C in math and a B in English, and the school never took the report card down. Easter egg hash height 9. The Simpson living room television channel. The television in the Simpson family living room, always on, always in the background when the family is at home, shows specific programming in background shots when the camera catches the screen during scenes where no one is actively watching. The programming visible on the background television is always drawn from the fictional Springfield television universe. Krusty's show, Eye on Springfield, the various fake commercials and news broadcasts that the show has developed as recurring background media. But in a specific subset of episodes from seasons 4 through 6, The television in the background shows programming that does not correspond to any established Springfield channel. It shows what appears to be footage from outside Springfield generic American television imagery that does not fit the show's established fictional media landscape. In these background moments, something from outside is coming through the television. The family is watching it without watching it. The outside world is in the living room, in the background, and nobody in the foreground has noticed. Easter egg #90. The constant light in Lisa's room. In exterior night shots of the Simpson house, establishing shots used at the beginning of late-night scenes, returning characters approaching the house after dark, the light in each family member's bedroom window tells a story about who is awake. Homer and Marge's window is usually dark by a reasonable hour. Bart's window is usually dark or shows the flickering light of a television. But Lisa's window, in night establishing shots across multiple seasons, is consistently lit. Not always brightly, sometimes just the suggestion of a lamp, a dim glow at the edge of the window, but consistently present across dozens of late-night establishing shots when the rest of the house is dark. Lisa's light is always on. She is always awake when the rest of Springfield is asleep. She has been the light in the dark house for 36 years, and it has been visible in every night establishing shot of Evergreen Terrace, in the background, for anyone who thought to look up at the windows. Easter egg #hone, the 2 Snowball problem. The Simpson family's first cat, Snowball, died before the show's timeline began. The family replaced her with Snowball 2, a black cat who became the permanent feline resident of 742 Evergreen Terrace. This is well known. What is less well known is a background continuity detail in the episodes immediately following Snowball's introduction. In several background shots of the Simpson living room during seasons 1 and 2, 2 cat food bowls are visible near the kitchen doorway. Not one bowl for the current cat. 2 bowls, side by side, as if the family has not quite gotten around to removing the second bowl since the first cat's death. By season 3, only 1 bowl is visible in those same background shots. The show never acknowledged the transition. Nobody said they removed Snowball's old bowl. The bowl was simply in the background during the period of grief, and then it was not. The way objects from the dead stay in their places long after we have processed the loss and then quietly disappear one day without ceremony. The background tracked a family's grief in the placement of a cat food bowl across 2 seasons without a single line of dialogue. Easter egg #2. The Flanders fence post repair. Ned Flanders' property line with the Simpson house is defined by a wooden fence that has been present since the earliest episodes of the show. In season 4, in the background of an outdoor scene involving the 2 families, one of the fence posts on the Flanders side is visibly worn at its base, the wood grain roughened, the paint slightly chipped, the post showing the effects of years of weather and contact with the ground. In season 7, in a similar outdoor background shot, that specific fence post has been repaired. The wear is gone, the paint is consistent with the surrounding posts, the base is solid. Ned Flanders fixed his fence post in the background sometime between seasons 4 and 7. The repair is only visible because the damage was visible first, and only matters if you were watching the fence closely enough across 3 seasons to notice the difference. Ned fixed his fence. He did not tell anyone. He just took care of his property the way Ned Flanders takes care of everything quietly, thoroughly, without requiring anyone to notice or approve. Easter egg #3. The treehouse tree's growth. The treehouse in the Simpson backyard, Bart's headquarters, fortress of solitude, and launching pad for dozens of plots across the show's history, sits in a large oak tree in the right rear corner of the yard. In the show's floating timeline, nothing ages. But the tree has been subject to what appears to be a gentle, gradual background continuity adjustment across the show's earliest seasons. The canopy of the tree in the background of backyard shots from season 2 is slightly more compact, the branches slightly less spread, than the canopy visible in background shots from season 6. The change is so gradual that it reads simply as variation in background art rather than intentional growth. But the progression from a slightly tighter canopy to a slightly more expansive one is consistent enough across enough episodes to suggest that someone was maintaining a sense of the tree's slow development, even in a show where nothing else grows, even in a timeline that refuses to admit time is passing. The tree grew. Nobody was supposed to notice. The background did it anyway. Easter egg #4 Bart's crusty collection. Bart Simpson's bedroom is decorated with Krusty the Clown merchandise posters, toys, accessories in a way that establishes Bart's fandom as a defining character element from the show's earliest seasons. The specific pieces of merchandise visible in the background of Bart's room have been cataloged by fans tracking the room's contents across seasons. What emerges from that catalog is a collection that expands over the show's early seasons, new pieces of merchandise appearing in the background of the room, fitting the timeline of Krusty product releases that are referenced in the foreground of various episodes. The collection grows. The background of Bart's room was being maintained as a living record of his fandom, updated with new background merchandise when the foreground of the show introduced new Krusty products. The room is an archive of Bart's commercial relationship with his idol, maintained in the background across seasons, visible only to viewers who were tracking what Bart owned and comparing it to what Krusty had recently released. Easter egg #height 5 Marge's hair shadow. Marge Simpson's hair is perhaps the most physically implausible element of a show full of physical implausibility. It rises approximately 2 feet above her head in a solid blue column that maintains its form regardless of weather, humidity, physical activity, or the laws of gravity. In outdoor scenes where sunlight is present, the shadow cast by Marge's hair should be enormous, a thick column shadow extending away from her body at whatever angle the light dictates. And in the background of outdoor scenes involving Marge in direct sunlight, the shadow is there. It is enormous. It extends across the ground behind her in exactly the proportion and angle that a 2-foot vertical structure would create given the light source's position. Someone on the background art team, working on the ground detail of an outdoor scene, accounted for the shadow of an impossible hairdo and rendered it correctly. The most physically impossible element of Marge Simpson is casting physically correct shadows in the background of scenes. The physics of the impossible hair are being honored in the pavement. Easter egg #height 6. Moe's phone number area code. Moe's tavern phone number, the number that Bart calls to request a fictional customer, producing Moe's escalating outrage at the prank, has been used across dozens of episodes. The number is displayed on a small card visible in the background of bar scenes near the phone. In the earliest seasons, the area code visible on that card corresponds to a Missouri area code consistent with the 636 geographic hints scattered across the show's background details. But in background shots from Season 8 onward, the area code on the card near Moe's phone has been updated. The new area code visible on the card corresponds to an Oregon area code. Moe's phone number changed its area code between Season 4 and Season 8. The foreground never acknowledged this. The background simply updated the card, the way a real bar would update its telephone information when the area code system was reorganized, maintaining Springfield's actual geographic identity in the background of a bar scene with a continuity detail so small that almost nobody was ever going to catch it. Easter egg #height 7. The Krusty Burger nutritional label. The Krusty Burger restaurant appears in background shots across dozens of episodes, and the menu boards and counter displays in these backgrounds have been the subject of detailed documentation. Among the details visible in high-resolution background shots of the counter area is a nutritional information placard for the Krusty Burger, the signature item. The placard is partially legible in a handful of episodes. The values visible on the placard are not randomly generated high numbers as a joke about fast food. They correspond to the actual nutritional content of a real fast food burger of similar description, accurate to a level of specificity that required actual nutritional research to produce. Someone on the background art team looked up the real calorie and fat content of a comparable fast food item and put accurate numbers on a background placard that most viewers would never read. The Krusty Burger is nutritionally documented in its background detail with the same accuracy you would find on a nutrition facts label in a real restaurant. Springfield's worst food is accurately labeled in the background. You would just have to pause the right frame to read it. Easter egg #height 8. The mystery report card. In a Season 4 episode involving Bart's academic performance, a report card is visible in the background of a scene in Principal Skinner's office. The report card is not Bart's. Bart's grades are referenced in the foreground dialogue and are consistent with his established academic character. The background report card, partially visible on Skinner's desk, contains different grades: a C in mathematics, a B in English, satisfactory marks across the board. These are not failing grades. They are the grades of a student who is doing adequately, not thriving, not failing, just present and functional in the school system. The name on the report card is not readable. This is a report card for an unnamed student who is doing fine, present in the background of a scene about academic failure, as if the background is reminding you that most students in Springfield are just quietly getting through school without drama. The C student is in the background. The F student is in the foreground. Springfield's education system contains both, and the background has documented the one the show never follows. Easter egg #height 9, the outside world on the background TV. In a Season 6 episode set in the Simpson living room, the background television is briefly visible during a scene that is not about television. The show playing on the background TV is not the fictional Springfield television content that the show usually generates for background programming. It is a brief clip of what appears to be news footage, real news graphics, real graphic design language, a lower third chyron, in the style of real 1990s American news broadcasting. The clip is too brief to be clearly identified, but its visual language is documentary rather than fictional. It looks like the real world has briefly appeared on the background TV in the Simpson living room. Whether this was an error, someone accidentally used real reference footage for a background screen, or a deliberate flash of reality in Springfield's mediated interior, the effect is disorienting. The outside world came through the television, just for a second, into a room where a cartoon family was dealing with something else entirely. And then the cut came, and Springfield's television went back to being Springfield's television. Easter egg #90, Lisa's light is always on. 742 Evergreen Terrace, viewed from outside at night, shows a specific pattern of lit and unlit windows that has been consistent across the show's nighttime establishing shots for decades. Homer and Marge's bedroom window is lit when they are home, and dark when they are out. Bart's window follows a similar pattern tied to his presence in the episode. But Lisa's room, in the upper right of the house as viewed from the street, is lit in nearly every nighttime establishing shot, regardless of what the plot of the episode requires, regardless of what time of night the scene is set, regardless of whether Lisa has been shown going to bed earlier in the episode. Lisa's light is almost always on. The background of Springfield's nighttime establishing shot has been quietly telling you, across 36 seasons of exterior shots, that Lisa is awake. That Lisa is in her room, at night, in the hours when the rest of the family has gone to sleep, doing whatever Lisa does when nobody is watching, reading, playing her saxophone, thinking about the things she cannot say aloud in a house where nobody quite understands her. Her light is on. It has always been on. The background has always known she was not sleeping. On the value of consistency over time. The continuity Easter eggs are the most quietly radical category in this entire collection, because they make an argument that runs against the grain of how most television is produced and watched. Most television assumes that viewers do not remember and do not notice the details that accumulate across seasons. Most television treats each episode as essentially self-contained, with the world refreshed to a baseline state that allows new viewers to enter at any point without confusion. The Simpsons officially operates this way. Its floating timeline and episodic reset structure are designed to allow any episode to function as a standalone experience. But the background of the show has always been doing something different. The background has been accumulating. The fence post ages and gets repaired. The tree grows. The cat food bowl disappears. The crusty merchandise collection expands. These details do not reset. They persist across the floating timeline, in the margins of a show that officially erases its own continuity, maintaining a kind of shadow continuity that runs beneath the official episodic structure. This shadow continuity is available only to the viewer who has watched enough and remembered enough to track it, who has seen the fence post in Season 4 and remembers it in Season 7, who has noticed the bowl in Season 1 and registered its absence in Season 3. It is a reward for the long-term committed viewer, a gift from a background art team that was quietly saying, "We see you. We know you are watching. We know you are paying attention to the things that most people miss. And we are maintaining a world for you, a world where the details hold and the continuity accumulates and the passage of time leaves its marks in the background, even when the floating timeline insists that time is not passing. You are not imagining it. The world is real. The details are there." Section 10. Easter eggs #91-101. The meta layer, the show watching itself. There is a final category of Simpsons Easter egg that is different in kind from everything discussed so far. Not a personal signature, not a cinematic reference, not a background continuity detail. The meta Easter eggs, the ones in this final section, are moments where The Simpsons does something that animated television shows simply do not do. It watches itself. It places material in its own background that references its own existence as a television program, its own production history, its own internal contradictions, the specific people who made it, and the specific cultural moment in which it is embedded. These are the Easter eggs that feel most like the show leaning over and whispering something directly in your ear, something it cannot say in the foreground, because the foreground is a story about a fictional family in a fictional town, and what the show wants to say is about something real. These meta-references are the show at its most self-aware, which is to say its most honest. They are the moments when Springfield's barrier between fiction and reality becomes permeable, when something from the real world comes through the wall of the cartoon and sits in the background of a scene, recognizable to anyone who knows where to look and invisible to everyone else. They are the closest the show has ever come to talking about itself directly, and they did it the only way Springfield knows how to tell the truth. Quietly, in the background, with plausible deniability. The meta layer is where the show's self-awareness becomes most philosophically interesting and most difficult to categorize as a simple Easter egg. By the time The Simpsons began embedding its own production apparatus in its background production codes, in background paperwork, the writer's room whiteboard as a prop, the actors' first names in the theater playbills, it had been running long enough to have a history worth referencing, an archive worth quoting, a self-image worth examining. The meta Easter eggs are the show looking at itself across time, the later seasons reaching back to reference the earlier ones, the production acknowledging itself as a production in the specific, quiet way that background details allow. This is different from the fourth wall breaks that appear occasionally in the show's foreground, the moments when a character acknowledges the audience or references the show's fictional status. Those foreground acknowledgments are jokes, played for a specific comic effect. The background meta-references are not jokes, they are records. They are the show maintaining its own archive in the only space available to it, the background, where the prop department and the background art team can place things without the writing staff having to script them, where the production can say things about itself that the characters cannot say, where the show can be honest about its own nature in the margins of its own fiction. The production code in the background paperwork is the purest version of this. It is not a joke. It is, in fact, the actual administrative code of the actual episode placed in the background of the episode it administers. The show and the record of the show have been unified in a single frame, the fiction and the production existing simultaneously in the same background prop. Springfield and the production of Springfield are the same place for one brief moment, visible to anyone who pauses and reads the paperwork on the desk in the background of a scene that is officially about something else entirely. Easter egg #91. The Fox broadcast notes. In a background shot of a memo visible in a Springfield office scene from the early seasons, the text of the memo readable in the brief moments when the camera holds on it includes language that directly mirrors the kind of notes that television network executives send to showrunners about episode content. The specific language visible in the background memo uses phrasing consistent with network broadcast standards feedback, concerns about content, suggestions for tonal adjustments, requests for the removal of specific references. The Springfield office memo is a Fox broadcast note. The show placed an actual network executive communication, or a carefully crafted simulacrum of one in the background of an episode, as a prop on a fictional desk where it would be visible to anyone pausing and zooming, and where it would be completely invisible to normal viewing. The show was documenting its own production constraints in its own background. Easter egg #92. The animation error acknowledgement. In a Season 9 episode from a period when the show was increasingly aware of its own reputation and increasingly likely to make jokes about that reputation, a brief background shot in The Simpsons' living room shows the family on the couch watching television. The television on screen, visible as a background within a background, shows a brief clip of an animated scene. The clip uses slightly different character proportions than the show's current animation standard, the proportions of a slightly earlier era of the show's production. The show is watching itself from an earlier season on its own television. The older version of the characters, rendered in the background of a living room scene, watches the current version from across the screen. The show acknowledged its own visual evolution by making it visible as television the characters were watching, in the background, where most viewers would see it as generic animated content rather than the specific self-reference it actually is. Easter egg #93, the production code. In background shots of documents visible in various Springfield institutional settings, the school, the city hall, the police department, certain official-looking papers include reference numbers in their headers. Several of these reference numbers have been documented as corresponding to actual production codes from the Simpsons' own episode production system. The production code for a specific episode appears as a background reference number on an official Springfield document in a separate episode. The show's internal production documentation was embedded as background prop text in a different episode's official-looking paperwork. Springfield's bureaucracy runs on the Simpsons' actual production codes. The files in the Springfield Police Department reference actual Simpsons episodes. Easter egg #94, the couch gag inventory. In a background shot of a Springfield storage or warehouse facility, the kind of background location that appears in a handful of episodes involving shipping, storage, or municipal supply. The crates and boxes visible in the background include labels that, when readable, reference objects that have appeared in previous couch gags. The couch from a specific memorable couch gag, the rocket from another, the alien chair. The objects that have appeared briefly in the title sequence and then vanished are stored in a background Springfield warehouse, cataloged and labeled. They went somewhere after the couch gag ended. They went to the warehouse. They are all there. The show has been accounting for everything that has ever appeared in its opening sequence, and it stored the inventory in the background of a warehouse scene that almost nobody has ever paused to study. Easter egg #95, the writer's room whiteboard. In a background shot briefly visible during a scene set in a Springfield office or production environment, the kind of background detail that appears in episodes involving television production or creative work, a whiteboard is partially visible on a wall. The content on the whiteboard, readable only at a freeze frame, contains what appears to be notes that match the format of a television writer's room development board. Story beats, character notes, episode titles in early draft form. The whiteboard visible in the background of a fictional Springfield scene is formatted like the actual Simpsons writer's room whiteboard. The show put its own creative process in the background of an episode as a prop, visible only to anyone who pauses and zooms, labeled with what appear to be draft story notes from the actual production. Easter egg #96, the cast list. In a background shot of a Springfield theater or performance venue, visible in episodes involving live entertainment, a cast list posted in the background of the venue includes names in the small print that, when readable, include first names that correspond to the first names of the actual Simpsons voice cast. Not Homer and Marge and Bart the character names, the actors' first names. Dan and Julie and Nancy and Yeardley assigned to fictional Springfield theatrical roles, listed in the background of a theater lobby scene that runs for approximately 3 seconds. The show put its own cast's first names on a fictional theater's cast list, in the background, where the only way to see them is to pause and zoom in on a lobby scene during a moment when the plot is happening somewhere else. Easter egg #97, the anniversary episode. In the episode that aired closest to The Simpsons' 10th anniversary, a background detail in the Springfield town square includes a banner that, read carefully, does not reference any fictional Springfield celebration. The banner references a specific duration, not a Springfield event duration, but a production duration that corresponds to the show's own run at that point. The show's 10th anniversary was quietly celebrated in the background of the episode that aired during that week, in a banner in the Springfield town square, without anyone in the foreground acknowledging it, without any voiceover or dialogue drawing attention to it. Springfield celebrated something in the background. The foreground kept going. The show gave itself a party and invited only the viewers who read banners. Easter egg #98, the animation cell. In a background detail that functions almost as a fourth wall break without being one, a piece of background art visible in a Springfield home. One of the paintings or framed pieces on a wall in a secondary character's house appears to be a rendering of an animation cell. The style of the art on the wall is consistent with how a production animation cell looks when framed. The bright, flat colors, the thick outlines, the slightly different compositional style from the surrounding environment. Someone in Springfield has a piece of animation art on their wall. The art on their wall looks like it was made in the same process that made the wall itself. It is a painting that resembles its own medium, hanging inside the medium it resembles. The show put a painting of itself inside itself, in the background, and waited. Easter egg #99 The replacement voice. In a crowd scene from a season where a major voice actor left the show temporarily and was replaced by a substitute, the background of the crowd scene includes a subtle visual detail. The character associated with the departing actor is present in the crowd, but their hair color is rendered slightly differently in background shots than in foreground shots within the same episode. In close-up foreground shots of the character, the hair is the established color. In the wide background crowd shots, it shifts by a few tones. The background art was tracking the replacement in a way the foreground was pretending not to. The show was aware of its own casting instability and was documenting it very quietly in the background color of a crowd scene. Easter egg Hassan00 The Groening signature. Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, has embedded his signature in the show's background art in a way that is documented but rarely discussed. Not in the credits, not in a cameo, not in a visible way. In specific episodes from the early seasons, the period when Groening was most actively involved in the show's visual development, a small, stylized M followed by a G is visible in certain background details, etched into a piece of background furniture, scratched into the surface of a background prop, incorporated into the decorative elements of a background mural. It is the artist signing the work in the way artists have signed works for centuries. Not prominently enough to compete with the foreground, but present and permanent. Springfield has his name in it, scratched into the furniture of the world he made. It has always been there. Most people have sat next to it for decades without noticing. Easter egg Hassan01 The end credits reflection. In the very final frames of certain episodes, the last second before the black screen that precedes the credits there is a detail in the Simpson family television screen that most viewers never see because they have already reached for the remote or the stream has already jumped to the next episode. The television screen in the living room, in these final frames, reflects something. Not the show the family was watching. The reflection in the screen is too dark to read clearly, too brief to study. But in the episodes where it is present, it has been described by those who have paused and studied it as reflecting the living room from a slightly different angle, an angle that would correspond to the perspective of someone sitting across the room from the television, watching the family watch television. Not a character in the episode, not a camera. A presence in the room that is reflected in the television screen for the final second of the episode before everything goes dark. The show watching the family being watched from inside their own living room. The observer in the reflection that is there for 1 second at the end and then gone. Springfield has always been watched. The show has always known it. And in the last second, before the screen goes dark, it shows you the watcher, very briefly, in the reflection of a television that has been on for 36 years. And that is Springfield. That is the second Springfield, the one that lives in the background of the show you have been watching your whole life, in the margins, in the corners, in the sounds that play behind the dialogue, and the details that exist below the level of the plot. A Springfield built from personal signatures and private references and cinematic love letters and dark environmental truths, and the quietly maintained continuity of a fence that needed a new post, and a cat that aged between seasons, and a light that was always on in a young girl's bedroom. Window. The foreground of The Simpsons is about a family. The background of The Simpsons is about everything else, every obsession, every memory, every private grief and private tribute that the people who made it could not fit into the script and so pressed into the margins instead, where it would be there for anyone patient enough to find it. 101 Easter eggs. 101 small doors into the Springfield that exist behind the Springfield. And somewhere in the background of an episode you have probably watched a dozen times, there is one more that nobody has found yet. The show has been running for 36 years. It has been very patient. It can wait. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If this helped you drift off somewhere comfortable tonight, leave a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is. It is always 2:42 on the microwave in Springfield, but your time is your own. Subscribe if you want to come back because there is always more in the background. Extended section. Easter eggs has own 101 deep dive companion notes on the Springfield numbers obsession. The relationship between The Simpsons and specific recurring numbers extends well beyond the examples documented in the first section. There is a documented tendency across the show's production history for numbers that appear in background signage, price tags, license plates, and institutional reference materials to cluster around a small set of values that have never been publicly explained by the production. The number 52, for example, appears with unusual frequency in background contexts that have nothing to do with playing cards or weeks in a year. It shows up on mailbox numbers, on classroom assignment sheets, on the back of background characters' jerseys. The number 17 appears frequently in background contexts associated with Springfield's civic and governmental institutions' addresses, reference codes, building designations. Whether these recurring numbers represent personal signatures from specific background artists, inherited from some original production style guide, or accreted through the shared intuitions of a large creative team working in the same visual space for decades, their consistency is real and their explanation remains private. What is clear from studying these background numbers is that Springfield's visual world was never randomized. Numbers in the real world are arbitrary. The address on your house has nothing to do with anything meaningful. It is simply the next number in a sequence. But numbers in the background of The Simpsons were chosen by people, and people's choices are never truly arbitrary. Every background number in Springfield came from somewhere. Most of them came from someone's private life, a jersey number, a street address, a date, a telephone extension, and that private life is now permanently embedded in the background of a show that will be watched for the rest of recorded human history. The people who put those numbers there did not know that. They were just filling in background details on an animated show. But they signed their work in the only language available to them, in numbers, in the background, in a town that was always going to last longer than anyone expected. On background characters as emotional architecture, the background characters of Springfield serve a function that goes beyond simple world building. They are the emotional architecture of the town, the structures within which the main characters move, the evidence that Springfield exists as a place with its own weight and texture, independent of the Simpson family's experience of it. A town populated only by the characters who appear in the foreground of plots would feel like a stage set. Flat, functional, unconvincing. Springfield feels real precisely because its background is populated by people who have their own existence, their own problems, their own relationships that are being quietly tended to in the margins. The Easter eggs embedded in background characters are the show's way of honoring this function. By maintaining the Van Houten curtains through the divorce, by keeping the Leftorium boxes in Ned's garage, by tracking the squeaky-voiced teen's name tag across his many service jobs, the background art team was treating Springfield's secondary residents as people rather than props. They were saying, these details matter, these continuities matter, even if nobody is watching them closely. Especially because nobody is watching them closely. The care for background characters that nobody monitors is the purest form of craft, doing it right when there is no audience for the rightness, when the only beneficiary is the fictional world itself. The Simpsons has been doing this since its first season, long before anyone was writing analyses of its background continuity, long before the internet existed to catalog these details. Someone was tracking Ned's fence and lighting Lisa's window and placing the right books on Marge's shelf. They were building a town. They were taking it seriously. And the town has lasted because of that seriousness in its foundations, even when the foreground story was at its least serious, even when the couch gags were elaborate and the plots were broad and the reality of Springfield seemed the furthest thing from the show's concerns. On the cinematic background as artistic dialogue, the film references embedded in The Simpsons' background are not simply trivia. They represent an ongoing artistic dialogue between a medium television animation that was underestimated at the time and a medium theatrical cinema that was not. The writers and animators who embedded Hitchcock compositions and Kubrick carpets and Spielberg silhouettes in the background of Springfield episodes were not just showing off their film knowledge. They were making a claim that animation could contain cinema, that a cartoon could hold within it the full weight of the film tradition, that Springfield's walls and streets and skies were capable of carrying the same meanings as Vertigo's staircase or 2001's Starfield. This claim has been vindicated by the history of the show. The Simpsons is now studied in film schools alongside the works it references. Its background compositions are analyzed as seriously as the cinematic images they quote. The medium that was condescended to became the medium that contained all the others. And the evidence for that transformation was always in the background, in a 2-second vertigo staircase, in a red coat in a monochrome crowd, in a Casablanca departure board at the edge of Springfield's airport, waiting for the moment when the audience was ready to take it seriously. On sound as a secondary text, the audio Easter eggs documented in the sound design section represent a category of embedded reference that is genuinely more difficult to access than visual Easter eggs, and that difficulty is part of their meaning. To catch a visual Easter egg, you pause the frame and look. To catch an audio Easter egg, you have to be paying a fundamentally different kind of attention, not visual attention, but something more like musical literacy, the ability to recognize a melody or a harmony in the fraction of a second it is audible beneath the dialogue and the plot. This means that the sound Easter eggs in The Simpsons were always speaking to a smaller audience than the visual ones. The Herman quotation in the suspense scene, the 12-tone row beneath Professor Frink's laboratory, the changed final chord in the credits, after an emotionally significant episode, these were communications between Alf Clausen and a handful of classically trained musicians in the audience who were listening to the underscore, closely enough to catch what he was doing. They were private conversations conducted in public, in a medium that theoretically broadcast to millions, using a language that only a few people present could understand. This is the deepest form of Easter egg, not hidden visually, not even hidden intentionally, but hidden by the rarity of the attention required to find it. The show was always speaking to both its audiences simultaneously, the enormous general audience watching the foreground and the small, attentive audience listening to the background. The general audience got the comedy. The small audience got everything else. On dark background details as honest testimony. The dark Easter eggs documented in the 8th section, the lead paint in the school, the Burns estate's separate water supply, the missing child poster, the burned forest near the plant, represent the show's most uncomfortable honesty. These details were placed in the background precisely because the foreground could not contain them. The Simpsons is a comedy. It uses Springfield's problems as material for jokes, and jokes require a kind of resolution, a punchline, a reset, a shared acknowledgement that the darkness has been named and can now be released through laughter. But some of Springfield's problems are not resolvable. They are structural, systemic, ongoing. The contamination does not stop. The inequality does not close. The institutional failures do not get corrected. These are not problems that can be given a punchline. So the show put them in the background and kept them there, season after season, episode after episode, as a kind of running testimony. The lead paint is in the background of the school, because lead paint is in the background of real schools, and the show wanted to say so without saying so, wanted to show you the thing it could not directly address, trusted that someone in the audience would eventually pause the frame and read the wall. The dark background details are the show refusing to pretend everything is fine even when the foreground insists that it is. They are Springfield's actual news, filed in the margins, available to anyone with enough patience to look, on continuity as love. The continuity Easter eggs in the 9th section, the fence post, the cat, the treehouse tree suggests something about the nature of care in creative work that is easy to miss when you are focused on the Easter eggs as individual discoveries. The accumulated weight of these small, maintained continuities is a form of love. Not the kind of love that announces itself, not the kind that requires recognition, but the kind that shows up every day and does the work of keeping the world consistent, even when nobody is checking. Someone at The Simpsons decided that the fence post should look repaired in Season 7 because it was worn in Season 4. That decision was not required by any script. It was not going to be noticed by more than a handful of viewers in the show's entire history. It was done because the person who did it cared about the reality of that fence, about the reality of Ned Flanders's well-maintained property, about the idea that in Springfield, at least in the background, at least in the details, things happened the way they would happen in a real place. That care is everywhere in the background of this show. It is in the shadows that fall correctly from Marge's impossible hair. It is in Lisa's light that is always on. It is in the river that runs past the power plant. with a bend shaped like a real Oregon River in the background of a cartoon, carrying whatever the plant puts into it, flowing through Springfield in the dark. On meta references as the show's final honesty, the meta Easter eggs in the final section represent the point at which The Simpsons' relationship with its own existence becomes most philosophically interesting. A show that places its own production codes in its own background paperwork is a show that has become aware of itself as an artifact, not just a story, but a made thing. With a history, with a production process, with a specific set of people who built it, and a specific cultural moment in which it was embedded. The meta references are the show documenting its own existence while pretending to be a cartoon about a fictional family. This is the deepest Easter egg of all, and it is not hidden in any single frame. It is hidden in the totality of the background and the accumulated weight of all the details discussed across this entire document, all the signatures and references and continuities and dark truths and sound design tributes and geographic memories. The show is the Easter egg. Springfield itself is the Easter egg. 36 years of background detail, pressed into the margins of a comedy show, building up slowly into a portrait of the people who made it, the culture that contained them, the world they were watching, and the private things they wanted to say about all of it. The Easter egg is the whole show, seen from the background. It has always been there. You just had to look. Final note: the background of the background. There is one more Easter egg, and it is the most abstract one. Every Springfield background exists in front of another background. The foreground characters move through the midground of the shot, and behind them is the background, the buildings, the streets, the sky. But behind the background there is always something more. The edge of a building that implies a street beyond it, the corner of a window that implies a room behind it, the horizon beyond the tire fire where something might be burning or might be Springfield extending outward into space that the camera never visits. Springfield is bigger than any single frame. It always has been. The background implies more background, and behind that, more. The show has been creating edges of a world for 36 years, and most of those edges have never been explored, never been followed, never been the subject of an episode or a close-up or a moment of attention. They are out there, in the background of the background, quietly existing. Blinky's river keeps flowing past the edge of the frame. The tire fire keeps burning beyond the last billboard. Lisa's light stays on in the house at the end of the street, past the edge of the establishing shot, in the part of Springfield nobody visits. And somewhere in the background of a scene that has not aired yet, there is a number on a license plate, a book spine on a shelf, a shadow on a wall, a single note in the underscore placed there by someone who cared, for someone who would eventually notice. In the town that has always been larger than anyone thought, Springfield is still going. The background is still there. All you have to do is look. On Springfield as a shared dream, there is a version of Springfield that exists only in the background, assembled from all the details this document has cataloged. The 74 on the license plate, the curtains in Luann's apartment, the Voynich manuscript on Frank's wall, the stained drainage channel, Lisa's light that is always on, the Cascade Mountains on the horizon, the wrong note in the theme, the flood line on the house at 742. This Springfield is not the Springfield of any single episode or any single story. It is the Springfield that accumulates when you watch everything and remember everything and pay attention to the frame rather than only to the foreground. It is a richer Springfield than the one most viewers see. It is contaminated and literate and geographically precise and musically sophisticated and quietly tracking the slow movements of time and damage across decades of background shots. It contains the private lives of the people who made it their jersey numbers and their hometowns and their mathematical obsessions and their literary loyalties pressed permanently into the corners of frames that flashed by in 2 seconds of screen time and will last as long as the recordings. Hold. This is the Springfield that the Easter eggs collectively reveal, not a quirky fictional town, not a comedy backdrop, but a constructed world built with the kind of care that is usually reserved for things that are considered important. The people who built the background of The Simpsons clearly considered it important. They treated the margins as seriously as the center. They built a world in the corners of someone else's story, in the spaces between the punchlines, in the background of the background, and that world is still there. Every frame of the show is still available, still pausable, still full of details that were placed there by specific people in specific years for reasons that are now mostly private and sometimes decipherable and occasionally absolutely clear. The background is waiting. It has been waiting since 1989. It will be waiting for as long as the recordings last, which may be a very long time indeed. Springfield is going. The background is open. The details are there. All you have to do is look. A final word for wherever you are. If you have made it to this point through 101 Easter eggs, through the numbers in the background and the curtains that followed a mother out the door, and the mountains that are always the cascades and the music that changed its final chord after the hard episodes, then you have spent a significant amount of time in Springfield's background, in the margins of a show that has been hiding things there for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. There is something appropriate about doing this at night, or in the early hours of a morning, or in the particular quiet of whatever hour it is, wherever you are right now. The background of The Simpsons has always been a place for a certain kind of attention, slow attention, patient attention, the kind that is most available when the day has wound down and the foreground of life has gone quiet, and there is space for the details. The details are always there. They are available at any time, but they are easiest to find in the hours when the world has stopped asking you to pay attention to the urgent things. This is what sleep content and long-form background analysis have in common. They are both asking you to let the foreground go and settle into something quieter and more patient. The Easter eggs in Springfield's background were always going to be here when you had the time for them. They were built by people who were taking their time with the work, filling in the corners with care, placing signatures and references and private jokes in frames that would last decades beyond the day they were drawn. They did the patient work. This is the patient watching. Springfield is still there. The background is still full. Lisa's light is still on in the upper right window, visible in the background of every nighttime establishing shot of Evergreen Terrace, keeping her company across 36 years of dark and quiet hours. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, the background has been waiting. Sleep well.